Hey folks, for many years now, people have been asking me how I would rank the different leveling speeds of every WoW specialization. While this is a question I've always wanted to answer, I felt it was important to do the proper research before making a definitive tier list. Over the last year, I've spent a ton of time doing test runs for every spec in the game, and now that I've completed runs with all 39 of them, I feel confident in my ability to accurately compare them in a tier list. Also, while I will be discussing my reasoning for where I rank each spec in this video, if you want to actually see them in action, I've compiled a list in the description that includes links to all of the different speedruns where these specs are featured. With all of that out of the way, let's dive into the tier list. Okay, so before I begin ranking all of these different specs, we need to set up some ground rules. Basically, how am I going to be ranking all these different specs? Like, what's the criteria? What does every single tier mean? Why is there NA down here? And to kick things off, I think the most important thing to establish is that this is a purely solo leveling tier list. If you watch my channel at all, you know I primarily do solo speedruns, and really that is the only fair way to evaluate all of these specs. There's a lot of specs that are fine if they're in a group, but the reality is most of the time you can get any sort of group comp working. Doesn't really matter, you'll just be getting carried by everything else. So the only real way to compare these specs directly is by saying how well they do in a purely solo 10 to 60 speedrun. And on that note, I'm primarily going to be analyzing this from levels like around 1 to 60, more so like 10 to 60. Levels 1 to 10 for all specs don't really matter. Most of the speedruns I do are in the 10 to 60 range. And that's because when you're at low levels, that is when the differences or like the strengths and weaknesses of every spec is most apparent. At high levels, specifically from 60 to 70 in Dragonflight, a lot of specs are just kind of the same. They may have different playstyles, different ways that they, achieve damage or survivability, but most of them get their tools together by the time they hit level 60, and their leveling speeds are fairly comparable. But there are some specs that get everything at level 10 the moment they really get into the meat of leveling, and then some specs are just in dire straits all the way up until level 40, and then they only start to kind of be on the level of some of the better playstyles. So that is what we're going to be taking into consideration here. A lot of people will say, oh yeah, you said the spec isn't very good, but when it gets XYZ ability at level 60, it really comes online. But if a spec is bad for 90% of the leveling process, and it's just quote-unquote good at the very tail end, that doesn't mean a whole lot. And also, I should note that because this is a speed leveling tier list, I'm going to be evaluating it based on how well it performs in my speedrunning route, the one that I've used for all of my world records, which is mainly questing focused, but does include some dungeons, and obviously those would be solo queue, like random dungeon finder dungeons, so assuming you don't have like a pre-built comp or something like that. If you are unfamiliar with the questing route that I use, then congratulations, you can watch the videos on my channel. You now have discovered the fastest way to level. But I think most people that are familiar with my channel already know that that is how I evaluate the different specs, and that will continue into this tier list. So, with all of that said, first few things I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the not applicable category, and that is for Evoker specifically. Just going to throw them in here and then talk about why I'm not ranking Evoker. Now, as I said before, the only way that you can really fairly compare all of these different specs is through the entire leveling process, 1 to 60 or 1 to 70, and Evoker starts at level 58 currently. It does not share the same starting level with every other spec in the game. Even like Death Knights and Demon Hunters, they start at level 8, but that is so early on that it doesn't really matter. You can pretty much compare them 1-to-1 with any other spec. But Evokers already start with their entire kit, and from levels 60 to 70, like I said, many specs feel too similar for these to really stand out on their own. Now, eventually I will create a War Within tier list. Evokers are going to be starting just at level 10. I think they might start at level 8. I haven't looked into it. But they will be a normal leveling class where they gain their abilities, like, as they level up. They have to, choose where they want their talents to go, just like everything else in the next expansion. And when that time comes, Evokers, I will be able to rank them fairly on this tier list. For now, I don't want to muddy the waters. I don't want to compare them with stuff that you just can't really compare them to, so they're going down here. I am putting them in this order, though, in terms of how I would rate them for leveling. I have also done a few different speedruns with Evoker, which I've included in the video description. I've even done an AUG speedrun just to see how bad it is, and Yes, it is as bad as you may expect. Evoker is one of the worst specs to level from 60 to 70 just because its kit does not function in a leveling setting. It is a support spec, it is focused around buffing other people, and if you are leveling on your own, or even leveling in a random dungeon with random people who likely aren't optimizing really well, there's not a whole lot you can do to speed things up. It is absolute misery. Preservation, there's really not much to say. It is a normal healing spec. I haven't really done a full testing run with it. I've tested it a bit on my own, just because, like I said, it doesn't fit into this format. It is okay. Nothing special. If you want to level through dungeons and you want to play a healer, play this. But for solo leveling, Devastation is king if you're leveling an Evoker from 60 to 70. But it doesn't really stand out compared to a lot of the other stuff, particularly. So, wanted to at least include Evokers, because I'm sure there are going to be a few people who are looking to level one, see this tier list, and if I didn't include them at all, they'd be like, where's Evoker? Why aren't you including it? So, I'm mentioning it. Obviously, solo leveling, play Devastation. Dungeon leveling, if you want, for faster queues, play Preservation. That's really all I will say on the subject. Now, with Evokers covered, as far as how I'm going to be ranking everything on these tiers, what each category means, in order to explain that, I need to set the first two specs down on this tier list. This is going to come as no surprise to anybody who has watched my speedruns in the past. Guardian Druid and Windwalker Monk. This is the S tier. This is the only, or these are the only two classes or specs that'll be entering the S tier. It is pretty locked in, set in stone, and this is something that I've been saying for years now, that if I were to ever make a tier list, it would only be Guardian Druid and Windwalker in S tier, and nothing has changed. And if you want to know why, just go watch my world records. There's a reason why I always use one of these two specs, and they are just head and shoulders above any other specs in the game. So, for Guardian Druids, to recap for anybody who hasn't seen a lot of those faster speedruns, they just do it all. They are a tank, so they get tank queues. I'm not going to be heavily favoring that. Obviously, Windwalker doesn't get tank queues, but it can play Brewmaster. But it is something that's worth noting, right? These two classes both can get tank queues. Guardian Druid can do it without changing specs, which is honestly one of the reasons why it is slightly ahead of Windwalker here, and primarily why I use it for some of the more recent world records. But also, it is just unkillable. If you are playing correctly, you cannot die as a Guardian Druid. It does ridiculous damage. It has really good single target. It has some of the best AoE in the game while leveling. It has insane mobility. Flight form as a Druid is something that pretty much no other class can do. It's just ridiculously powerful, and it is one of the reasons why I would say as a class, Druids are just the strongest class period for leveling. And really, there's just no downside to Guardian Druids. They have every single strength, they have no weaknesses, and flight form just puts them even further ahead. So they are S tier, they are used in all of my world records, it is that simple. Now you'll notice that I'm not putting the other Druid specs in S tier, and that is because while many of them will be higher up, specifically Balance and Feral, we'll see where they fall within this midsection here, but they have a lot of the strengths of the Druid class, but Guardian is significantly better in pretty much all areas. I would say, we'll discuss this a bit more when we get to Feral. It does about the same damage as Guardian, but it is weaker in other areas. Same with Balance, and then definitely same with Resto. Resto just has really no strengths compared to Guardian. So even though a lot of them have access to really good mobility in like travel form and flight form and stuff, Guardian Druid is head and shoulders above them, so it goes in here. Pretty straightforward. As for Windwalker, this one, I have debated at times putting Brewmaster up in S tier as well, because in my Monk speedruns, by world records, currently it's done with the Druid, but I have at various points gotten world records with Monk. In those runs, I use a combination of both Windwalker and Brewmaster. So technically speaking, in that case, Brewmaster should be up here. And I will discuss it a bit more in terms of how it performs completely solo without the inclusion of Windwalker later. But the thing about Brewmaster is I primarily use it just for tank queues, because whenever I need to do dungeons, specifically Burning Crusade dungeons early on in the route, obviously getting instant tank queues makes it worth running, because otherwise I'd just be sitting there for 5 minutes with Windwalker, and that's not ideal. But Brewmaster doesn't really compare to Windwalker when it comes to solo leveling speed. While Druids basically have all the same mobility in that they can use like sprint and cat form, they have travel form, etc., Monk mobility is definitely very different between the specs. Flying Serpent Kick is massive for Windwalker, and it's only for that spec. Brewmaster doesn't get that. So that is a huge mobility advantage specifically for Windwalker. And while Brewmaster is very tanky, it is actually one of the squishier tanks while leveling. And in some cases, Windwalker has better survivability than Brewmaster because of the way that some of its talents work, specifically Turbo Fists. It's a PvP talent that makes it so when Fists of Fury is active, you parry all incoming attacks. That is massive for large AoE leveling pulls. It makes Windwalker extremely good, and the biggest difference is the damage. In fact, actually, since I've talked about it enough, I'm going to go kind of in sequential order throughout the rest of this and just talk about, Demon Hunter into Death Knight, etc. But I think because it's impossible to talk about Windwalker without talking about Brewmaster, I will just rank Brewmaster now. It is A tier. We will see where it falls within the context of A tier compared to every other spec, but it is definitely in there. It is a good spec. I've done many runs with just Brewmaster that have gone perfectly fine. It can hold its own, but it falls off in terms of damage. Windwalker is just so far ahead, and while the mobility is comparable, Windwalker is better. Survivability, it's also comparable, but, still Windwalker in some cases is even tankier. There is just no real situation outside of tank queues where Brewmaster beats out Windwalker. So I just can't justify putting it in S tier. If I was including the fact that it is used in the world record runs, maybe you could put it in low S. But I think that's just kind of murky territory, so I'm just going to keep it in A. And we are just going to acknowledge that if you are leveling as a Windwalker, you are switching to Brewmaster for dungeon queues, but in terms of, even Windwalker's performance, if you do queue as a DPS in dungeons, is fantastic. It kind of deserves to be in the S tier, but that, I think, should hopefully explain why I've also put it below Bear. And I think with that being said, that established, you may notice a few things that I talked about as far as how I'm comparing these specs. And the tiers, effectively, are defined by the S tier is the best leveling spec in the game, or these are the best leveling specs in the game. They can do it all, they are extremely fast, they have no weaknesses, and they can just level at ridiculous speeds. A tier is basically a slightly weaker version of S. They have no clear weaknesses, they can do pretty much everything, they're never in danger of dying, they can do really good damage and kill things efficiently. Their mobility is generally pretty solid, and they're not struggling to move from point A to point B, but there is some little defining factor that they lack. That just means they can't reach the same speeds as Windwalker or Guardian Druid. For Brewmaster, in this case, compared to Windwalker, as we already said, it's kind of the extra mobility, and Windwalker's abilities just do insane AoE damage beyond the bounds of everything else that'll fall into A tier. And another note that I should say for both monk specs, before I forget, this has been less of a factor lately, but monks have access to the Peak of Serenity, which is this secret monk quest hub that they can access with Zen Pilgrimage. In past expansions, this has been ludicrously broken, and in Mists of Pandaria and stuff, monks were the best leveling specs by far, or leveling class in general, because it gave you I think it was a 50% bonus to your experience, which just meant they were single-handedly the best leveling class because they got a massive bonus that other classes didn't get. This has been heavily nerfed in recent expansions. It's still very good. It gives you a large chunk of rested experience, which is effectively double XP for a set amount of time. And that is nice, but it is nowhere near as powerful. And I have, in various different runs, kind of gone back and forth on whether or not it is even worth still going out of your way to do these quests. They are definitely efficient, but at this point, routing for these speedruns has gotten so optimized that if you're following my route, half the time you don't even really need to do these monk quests. So, I don't know, it depends. It is definitely an advantage, though. And it is the reason why at some points I have done world record attempts with Monk over Druid, but as of late I feel that Flight Form is a bigger advantage compared to the Monk Teleport. Another thing is many specs that were really fast were kind of defined by their ability to quickly teleport to different areas of the world, because in older versions of the speedrunning route, so back in Shadowlands and early Dragonflight, you needed to go back to the main cities every 10 levels in order to learn your flying training. And there were a lot of times you'd have to bounce back and forth between your active questing hub and a main city to go either turn on chromie time, enter a dungeon, or, like I said, learn riding training. Recently, Blizzard has made it so at the moment you hit level 30 and level 40, etc., you immediately learn training wherever you are in the world, and it costs no money. And that means that the time advantage that you get from being able to quickly teleport back and forth from like a main city to a questing hub is significantly less important in speeding up a run. And monks used to be able to do that very easily by setting their Hearthstone to wherever they were questing, using their Peak of Serenity teleport, and then taking the associated portal to either Orgrimmar or Stormwind, and then they could very easily get the Riding Trainer and then use their Hearthstone. There are lots of other classes that can do that, and this is still kind of an advantage because at level 20, everybody should be returning to their main city to turn on War Mode. So it still kind of plays into the route. There are also times where you need to very quickly go back to the portal room in your main city and switch continents if you are done questing, let's say, in like the Cataclysm zones, and you want to move on to Warlords of Draenor. It can save like a few minutes doing that. So it is not completely ruled out of the run as a time save, but it is significantly less impactful than it used to be. Something that I kind of forgot to talk about when discussing monks. It still is an advantage though. But A tier relative to S tiers, like S tiers, these classes or specs have something that is a core advantage that nobody else gets access to. And they are still really good at everything that all the specs in A tier are. So as mentioned, Guardian Druid, insane mobility, insane damage, insane survivability, but Flight Form is just a crucial advantage that lets you effectively break the leveling route in some cases. I kind of touched upon this earlier, and maybe some people aren't quite as familiar with it, so just to expand upon that point, if you don't know what Flight Form does, it is an instant cast mount that moves at, flying speeds, and it lets you interact with quest objects while flying in the air. And there are quests that require you to pick up like multiple objects across a zone, and that is the entire objective, but the zone is covered with mobs. So for almost every spec in the game, all of those quests, you would need to fight your way through a lot of enemies, grab the quests, and then return to the quest giver. Druids just mount up, fly through the air, pick up everything, and then immediately fly back. And it is so broken when that is actually used, and it is an advantage that nobody else has access to, period. There is nothing in the game that can do what Flight Form lets you do. So, in addition to just being broken at everything, Druids have an inherent advantage. And of course, this will be taken into consideration when discussing Feral, Balance, etc., but like I said, Guardian is head and shoulders above them. And Monk, as mentioned, has all of that, plus the Peak of Serenity teleport and the Monk quests, which, while not as useful now as they are in the past, they are still a key advantage, really overpowered, like secret quests that nobody else has a comparable thing to. So I feel Windwalker deserves to go in S tier with Guardian Druid. Now, with that being said, we've covered what S tier means, what A tier means. B tier I generally define as, this is a category where they are lacking in one or more areas that the S and A tier specs can do. So maybe they do a ton of damage and they're really mobile, but they are so squishy. And if you ever try to stay in combat for a long time, this spec is going to suffer. And it relies very heavily on being able to kill things within its cooldowns. And if its cooldowns are up, it is fucked. It needs to start running. So that is an example. Another example could be, this spec does not die. It is completely unkillable. But if you try to kill something quickly, it's going to take a while. And you're just going to be sitting there wailing away on this mob and doing no damage to it. But at least you'll never be able to die. So specs like that can pull entire subzones and just cleave it all down. And it'll take a while, but they'll get there. Difference being, of course, Guardian Druid can do that and kill it quickly. But, at least this spec has something going for it. And that'll put it in B tier. Another example would be a few that will go in B tier are just kind of average at everything. It's like A tier, where they don't necessarily have any glaring weaknesses, but they are just kind of mediocre at all forms of, like, leveling efficiency. They do good damage, but not exceptional damage. They have okay survivability, where they, generally speaking, won't die, but if you put them in the most difficult scenarios possible while leveling, they will struggle, and their mobility isn't Death Knight mobility, which is, we'll get to that, but obviously Death Knights have terrible mobility. It's not that bad, but, if we're doing a 100-meter dash comparison, they're not going to be winning any world records. So that is kind of what I would classify as B tier. C tier would be specs that really struggle in one area. There is a very glaring weakness that just makes them fall behind pretty much everything else. So their damage is just really bad. Their survivability is just really bad. And this has a noticeable impact on how quickly you're able to level. Now, generally speaking, all specs that I will put in C tier, you still can level with them, but there is no situation where the spec that will be in C tier is your best option for that particular class. So every single spec in C tier, it's like, you can, technically speaking, reach level 60 or 70 playing this, but why would you want to when there are other options in B and A that just do it better? And I will discuss what those strengths and weaknesses are. And finally, D tier, I think I'm only going to put like one or two things in here. I have them in mind. These are generally specs that are just not suited for leveling in general. You could maybe, technically speaking, make them work, but they are just not built for the type of format that I'm using for this, which is, as I said before, solo leveling in the context of, doing quests and dungeons within the context of my route. And these specs are just lacking key areas in their kit where it's not even like they're bad. They are bad. But it's just very clear that Blizzard did not design them to be solo leveling specs. Kind of to give it away a little bit, we're going to put healers in this category. Not all healers. There are a few healing specs that I think will surprise a lot of people where they end up, because they are very, very powerful, even within the context of this type of tier list. But there are a few healing specs that I have in mind, two specifically, that will end up in here because they just aren't designed to do solo leveling. They really just aren't designed for leveling in general, and I think they're lacking. I considered putting like an F tier just as a way of saying no spec goes in here, as in like you technically can't play it at all. This would be like meme builds, but I figured every single spec in this game, you can technically, if you really want to gimp yourself, even the ones that I'm going to put in D tier, you can hit level 60 or 70 with them. This isn't classic WoW, where there are certain playstyles in classic WoW that are just absolute misery. You would never want to play this. Retail WoW, everything is at least somewhat finely tuned, but a few that are going to be in C and D are definitely lagging behind. Some of the ones in C tier I think are a bit more problematic because they are clearly designed to be something people should play, and there are major oversights in their kit, which we'll talk about. Anyways, with all of that being said, we can finally start ranking everything else relative to, the starting ones that we put in here, and we're going to be going just sequentially in order through all the different classes. So Havoc Demon Hunter. This one is a little bit weird. Havoc Demon Hunter is compared to, and this kind of includes Vengeance as well, is like the most odd spec out relative to everything else. It is kind of like the Evoker problem, where Havoc and Vengeance are still forced to do their starting zone. So they are the only specs that will be forced to start at level 8. And while this technically doesn't mean much in a vacuum, right? Like, if you want to level a Demon Hunter, obviously, that's your only choice. So it's not necessarily a downside, but it makes it a little bit hard to compare Demon Hunters one-to-one with other specs, because the start of every single Demon Hunter run will end up being significantly slower than every single other class, because they are forced to go through this pretty lengthy, like, RP cutscene-filled intro. And by the time they're done, they're like level 15, 16. They like unlock their kit in weird ways. And every other spec just starts the run and immediately jumps into dungeons. So I want to at least make that clear, just so you know there's some little differences there. But that being said, Havoc is definitely A tier. Havoc is really, really, really good. And I would play it more if I was able to neatly fit it into my traditional speedrunning format. In fact, there is a genuine argument to be made for Havoc being, like, I wouldn't say S tier, but, like, up there, if it could start in the same way as Guardian Druid and Windwalker. It will never be possible for Havoc to even be a contender for, like, world record speedruns because of that issue I just outlined, where you have to do the Demon Hunter intro. But the speed at which Havoc can level and, the tools at its disposal is ridiculous. It has godlike mobility. Its damage is really, 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 really good. Like, same as Guardian Druid and Windwalker, easily extremely good for leveling. And its survivability, while it is a little bit squishy, if you play around its cooldowns, it can easily solo any large pull in the game. It just requires like a little bit more finesse, I would say, than some of the other specs, like especially the tanks. But it is very good. It has Glide, which I wouldn't necessarily call Glide an inaccessible advantage, kind of like Flight Form, but it is very, very useful. It means you don't need to rely on things like Goblin Glider quite as much, which is a very popular leveling consumable. But yeah, it is a very, 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 very powerful leveling spec. I really wish that at some point Blizzard would give us the option to just skip the Demon Hunter intro, start this at level 10 like everything else, because I do think it has potential in that context to get world record runs, and I would love to at least try to match my times for Guardian and Windwalker, but I just can't. So right now, Demon Hunter speedruns are kind of in their own category, but Havoc is awesome. It is probably my favorite spec to actually do speedruns with. It is a blast to play. Really, really good. Vengeance. Oh boy, I have a very interesting history with Vengeance. So for context, for, people who aren't, super familiar with myself or the channel and stuff, at various points over the years, I have been rank 1 at Vengeance Demon Hunter for, like, endgame stuff, raiding, etc. And it is a spec that, just in general, I love playing when it is well designed. And Vengeance, when it is working well, can be really, really, really good. The leveling playstyle just really doesn't work. I honestly don't know exactly where I want to put Vengeance. It is good, but I would say it is one of the most problematic tanks to play at the lower levels. And even when you get to like level 60 and stuff, where I historically said that, everything starts to feel pretty good, Vengeance still struggles. It doesn't get its full kit. Actually, you know what? I cannot put it in A tier. It has to go in B tier. It's the first spec we're going to put in B tier. And as I said, B tier it has a few key weaknesses. Vengeance, its survivability is fine, but it is not spectacular. It is not Guardian Druid. There are definitely situations, especially at low levels, where you can overpull and you can die because its kit is just not fleshed out. And this is especially true with the Dragonflight rework. The Dragonflight rework absolutely fucked Vengeance. Pretty much all of its defining talents are in the bottom section of its spec tree. Its capstone talents. So it just feels completely gimped at lower levels. It can work. It is not bad, but its raw damage is nowhere near good enough to compete with the stuff Guardian Druid gets at level 10. Or we'll talk about some other tank specs, but they get infinitely more at level 10 than Vengeance even gets at like level 30. And it does have ludicrous mobility. That is something that it really does have going for it with like Infernal Strike. You can basically leap up platforms that you would normally need to like run around. But in the open world, that's not nearly as much of an advantage, especially when you get access to flying. And in dungeons, there aren't really any skips that you can do with a Vengeance Demon Hunter that you wouldn't be able to do with any of the other specs, so that isn't really that important. I think we said before, B is either glaring weakness or the definition of mediocrity. Vengeance Demon Hunter is the definition of mediocrity. It is a tank, so it is, in most cases, still unkillable, but its damage is not spectacular, and it just really doesn't have anything else going for it, and it's kind of, the same reason for Brewmaster, right? Where we said Brewmaster, it's good, it's a monk, but Windwalker does kind of everything Brewmaster does, but better. And I just don't really think that you can put Vengeance in the same tier as Havoc, when Havoc is a phenomenal leveling spec, and the only thing that Vengeance has is maybe slightly more survivability at lower levels than Havoc, but even then, it's like if you're playing Havoc really well, and leveling scenarios, it actually has almost more survivability. The only thing with Havoc is it's a little bit more reliant on, like, you have to kill mobs, steal their souls, and then get, like, the healing from that. And if you are chaining kills effectively, right, and you know how to play Demon Hunter, that is an extremely powerful way to, like, sustain yourself. Vengeance is a little bit more just you mash buttons and you take less damage, but yeah, it just has nothing going for it. So I have to put it in B tier. It's not bad, but it is just weak. The only reason why you would play this in a Demon Hunter run, and I have done runs where I play as Vengeance, is if you are queuing for dungeons. Because obviously then having the tank queue for the instant is nice, but it's not like Guardian where you're going to be soloing the entire dungeon and doing as much damage as everybody else combined. You will be lagging behind in actual numbers department. Speaking of which, it's actually very fitting that Blood DK comes right after Vengeance. It is roughly the same position for the same reasons. Blood DK is in a bit of a weird spot. It is maybe one of the worst specs in the game to do a completely, like, single spec run. And I would actually say, do not ever level entirely as Blood in a Death Knight run. You can maybe even argue that that bumps it further down. It's not C tier. It doesn't have any glaring weaknesses. Its damage is almost its most glaring weakness, which definitely sucks because it means that everything takes forever to die. But Blood DKs are fairly iconic for being completely unkillable, and that is very much the case while leveling. There is nothing that you can pull in any leveling scenario that you cannot survive as a Blood DK. It is still, I would say, maybe not even as tanky as Guardian Druids in the context of leveling, but it is close in terms of it really just can't die ever if it's played correctly. And that makes it really good for stuff like Yetimus, the Durnhold Challenge, which, if you're not familiar, those are two very difficult elite quests that are, historically speaking, you're supposed to require a group for that. But in my leveling speedrun, I always do those completely solo. And it is definitely not hard to do them solo if you are playing correctly. Blood DK completely trivializes it. It can absolutely do it solo, but whereas there are many other specs like Windwalker Guardian can kill Yetimus completely solo in like 10 to 15 seconds flat, sometimes less. Windwalker can like burst it down and then Touch of Death in 5 seconds or something. Blood DK will kill Yetimus, and it will do so without taking much damage, or at least without losing much health because it'll death strike all of it back. But it is going to sit there and wail on Yetimus for like 45 seconds, so it is very slow. The advantage of Death Knight, or Blood DK, of course, is that it has, I guess, tank queues, and it is unkillable. That's it. Its damage is significantly worse than both of the other two specs. None of these three specs have any significant advantage over the other in terms of mobility. Like we discussed earlier, that while monks traditionally have good mobility, Windwalker has something slightly better with Flying Serpent Kick. It's not really the case for any of the Death Knight specs. They're all pretty much the same. They have like Wraithwalk, Death's Advance. Wraithwalk sometimes you can't even really take because it's just in an awkward position in the Dragonflight tree. That's another thing. I don't love the layout of a lot of the Death Knight Dragonflight trees, and I'm generally really happy with how Blizzard did those trees, but some specs and classes got a little bit shafted. I think Death Knight's class tree is one of them. It's not the worst, not even close to the worst, but some of the positioning of certain utility spells, specifically Wraithwalk, is just kind of awkward and makes it really hard to take without sacrificing a lot of other stuff too. Would love to see that changed. Hopefully within the next expansion they'll change that, because there are many other classes, like, druids and monks, where you pretty much never need to sacrifice one thing to get another. All of your big utility spells are in very easy to access areas, and in many cases, you're questioning yourself at the end, like, what do I even spend my points on? Like, I have everything I want. I guess I'll take this other random talent that does something, because I don't really need it, but whatever. Whereas Death Knights, you have to very carefully plan out a lot of your talent points to specifically get a few things that you need, and that means you have to sacrifice a lot of things that you don't need, but you would like to have. With that being said, for the other two specs, as far as their damage, Frost is moderately better at AoE compared to Unholy. Unholy, conversely, is pretty good at single target, weak at AoE at lower levels, but this problem gets solved towards the end of the run. So by the time you've hit like level 50 all the way up to 70, Unholy actually has as good, if not better, AoE than Frost, whereas Frost never really recovers in the single target department. It's always lagging a good bit behind Unholy. Neither one of these specs is phenomenal. Death Knights in general, I think, I don't know if I would say they struggle, because their survivability is fine for all three of these specs. Everybody has Death Strike. You're never really concerned about dying. Uh, in terms of single target survivability, Unholy and Frost are a little bit not great, but you can always just spec swap to Blood and handle it, but that's not really ideal. I genuinely don't know where I put Frost and Unholy. Whenever I've thought about making this tier list, this is kind of one of the biggest things I'm unsure of, like, how would I compare it to everything else? On one hand, no matter where they go, they're going to be directly next to each other. I think I maybe put Unholy slightly ahead. At lower levels, Frost is slightly better. At higher levels, Unholy is slightly better. They are effectively interchangeable. They feel very similar in terms of how they deal with different situations. I don't know if I should put them in A, because technically speaking, they have no glaring weaknesses. Their mobility is a little bit weak. Would I rather, I guess... You know what, I'm gonna put them in A for now. But I think as we flesh out this tier list with other specs, I may bump them down to like the top of B tier, because their mobility is a key weakness. It is not bad enough to severely hinder them, even though it is like some of the weakest mobility in the game. But it definitely means that they can go no higher than like the bottom of A tier. They do good damage. They can survive pretty much anything, so they're not bad. But you're never going to excel nearly to the degree of something like Havoc or many of the other specs that we'll talk about. I think if the A tier ends up being super bloated, I will push them down to like the top of B tier, just to keep things relatively balanced. You know, you got to grade everything on a curve when it comes to these tier lists. For Boomkin, okay, now we're talking about the other Druid specs. So, Boomkin is B tier. The question is, do I put it below or ahead of the tank specs? I think I put it below. I know I am really risking the wrath of the chickens here. I know Boomkin players are very vocal, and whenever somebody shit talks Boomkins, they get really ruffled and stuff, but you really cannot get good results with Boomkin. It's a very weird playstyle. The thing about Boomkin that I will say is it is the best spec in the game at spread target AoE. So if there's a bunch of mobs over a large area, and you need to, like, cleave all of those mobs down evenly without, like, you know, having to run around and stuff, Boomkin is the best spec in the game at that. Unfortunately, that is just really not something that ever happens in a leveling scenario. It sometimes happens in the world while questing, but it's kind of one of those situations where a lot of the best specs are specs that can round up a large group of mobs and then group them up in like a little tight, dense area and then cleave them all down. Like, Windwalker can tag a bunch of mobs, it can round them up, it can, like, Ring of Peace to bounce some mobs in, leg sweep, and then it cleaves them all down. Brewmasters can do the same thing. Demon Hunters can also, like, kite a bunch of mobs, round them up, I-beam, Blade Dance, you know, you name it. Death Knights, of course, have grips. They can drag in mobs from farther away. So, in many cases, it is just better to group up mobs in one area and then kill them, compared to trying to cleave them all down at a distance. In many ways, Boomkin prefers cleaving down mobs just because it works with, like, you know, keeping up Starfall and putting up your dots and stuff. But it's just not really a great way to do damage. And it is really, really lacking in terms of both survivability and mobility. Not even close to enough to be in C tier. Like, you're never in danger of dying, but when I say it's lacking in survivability, I mean it can't really keep itself up passively while it's doing its full damage rotation. You have healing spells that you can use to keep yourself up, but whereas other specs like Guardian Druid can just press Frenzied Regen, and then suddenly you just can't die, and you keep spamming Thrash, Demon Hunters Leech or Steal Souls, Balanced Druids will need to actively stop doing damage to heal themselves up so that they don't die and can continue putting out stuff like with Starfalls and dots. And that works, but it doesn't feel great. And while they do have access to Flight Form, which of course is really good, and they have Travel Form, they don't really get a lot of the passive speed benefits that the other Druid specs get. Like Feral, obviously, when you're in cat form, you are moving faster passively. And Guardian Druid can pretty easily like shift into bear and like put up all of its bleeds, and then if you need to run like a quick distance, you can go into sprint, or you could shift into cat form, use sprint, and then like run a quick distance, then shift into bear form quickly, and you don't really lose anything. But you're pretty much just like worthless while running around in your forms as a balanced druid. Not enough that it like severely hinders them, but they are, I would say, the definition of mediocrity, right? So there is just no way that I can put them higher. They don't do the damage of any of these specs. They don't have amazing mobility, even though they are a druid. And survivability, it's not dire, but it is notably weaker. On that topic, Feral. Feral is a bit of a weird situation. I'm going to put it here for now. It's definitely A tier. The question is where it falls in A tier. I think it's going to end up being like low A. And for the longest time, I would always say that there was absolutely no reason to play Feral. Because why would you play Feral when Guardian does the same thing but better? And while that is still pretty much true, I think I very much underrated Feral because I was comparing it to Guardian a bit too much. Feral is severely lacking in survivability. It can shift into bear form, right? But its bear form is not going to be nearly as powerful. The thing that I have found after testing Feral a bit more is that it doesn't really need to shift into bear form, because its mobility is significantly better in terms of like in combat while fighting mobs compared to Guardian. Doesn't necessarily matter, but what that means is that it's able to put a lot of dots on mobs. Like it runs in, it rounds up a bunch of mobs, it does brutal slash a bunch of times, it puts up like Moonfire with Lunar Inspiration, which is worth taking while leveling just to tag things from range. And then you have all of these dots on these mobs, and they're all rotting out, and you're in cat form. You can just run away from them. They can't reach you. So you're going to take a lot of damage when you are applying all this stuff, but then you're running away, you get instant cast regrowths in cat form, so your survivability is never really an issue because your damage will proc those regrowths, so you're not actually having to sacrifice anything, really. And when I was actually testing Feral, I was very surprised by how quickly it was able to kill things without really losing out in any of the other categories. So it is definitely a very good leveling spec. It still has all the same advantages of Guardian, but I think the main downside, the main reason why it is still quite a bit weaker, is it does need to kite in order to get like all of its damage out effectively, because if you are sitting there and face tanking mobs as a Feral Druid, you will die. So you kind of need to let things rot out. It's not bad enough to the point where it like takes significantly longer to kill the mobs, but it is a glaring weakness because Guardian can do the exact same thing, except it can just sit there, face tank all the mobs, and continue pumping out more damage without ever getting scratched, and then immediately loot them, get any quest items, and move on to the next area. So it is still not as good as Guardian, but whereas, like, if you had asked me 2 years ago, where's Feral Druid, I'd, like, put it in D tier, right? Just dismissively, like, why would you ever play this? It's so much worse than, you know, Guardian. Having actually tested it fairly, it is actually not bad, but it is kind of the same thing of why would you play it when it plays very similar to Guardian and it is just much stronger. However, speaking of, if you had asked me, I would have put it in D tier. We have to put our first spec into D tier. Resto Druid. So it is... There is just no real argument to make for Resto Druid where it is anything other than D tier. It is, I think, the single worst spec in the game for leveling in this context. And honestly, I did fairly recently, one of the final tests that I did before making this tier list is I, in a single stream, tested every single healing spec in high-level dungeons, high level for like 40 to 60, right? Like the tail end of the leveling process. How do they compare? Back to back to back, so you can see very clearly the strengths and weaknesses of each one. And Resto Druid just really didn't feel like it was doing anything special as far as healing goes. Like, your healing is fine. I didn't let anybody die, like we never had any disaster situations, but it's not like I was doing so much more healing than every other spec. Like, if nobody in your dungeon group is dying when you are playing as a healer, then your healing effectively doesn't matter. All that matters is everybody alive? Did you complete the dungeon? If that has been achieved, then doing high HPS in a leveling setting just means fuck all. And in solo content, like, yeah, druids can heal themselves a good bit, but whenever they are healing, they are not doing damage. Whereas, as we've already stated, the other druid specs, right, can even Feral actually has better healing for solo content than Resto because it's getting free instant cast regrowths that can be used in cat form. So it is actively doing damage, whereas Resto just doesn't do that. And I think the more interesting thing about how Resto Druid does damage, and it's kind of how Druid works in general, there are a lot of other healing specs that we'll discuss where they have very unique playstyles, and the way in which they accomplish like doing damage as a healer is significantly different than the way that their associated DPS spec plays. And in some cases, that can actually put them higher up on the tier list because maybe for one particular type of damage, that healer actually is better than the DPS. But the way that Druid works, Resto has two options. They are either cat weaving or they are boomkin weaving. And what that means is you are just a worse version of this or a worse version of this. You have absolutely nothing that you bring to the table. There is nothing about Resto Druid in boomkin form that is better than boomkin. There is nothing about Resto Druid in cat form that is better than cat. Same with bear form. Absolutely nothing in Resto's kit puts them ahead of any other spec. And I think they are just the worst spec in the game for leveling because of that. You can get to max level with Resto, right? You have flight form. You have the ability to play effectively a store brand Guardian, a store brand Feral, a store brand Balance. And as we've established, like, these specs are fine, but you're just doing the same thing but worse. Will that work? I suppose, but why the hell would you want to subject yourself to that? It is just worse in every way for leveling compared to the other three Druid specs. And for that reason, I have to put it in D. It's kind of what I said earlier. In terms of a leveling context, this spec is just not designed to work for leveling. With the, context that we are doing for this, right? There, as I said before, there's one other spec that I will put here. I'd imagine some people with everything that I've just said in mind can already kind of figure it out, but, maybe it'll surprise people. All right, and moving on, we have Hunter, and this is really interesting. In fact, I actually, before recording this tier list, I sat down for a good 3 hours, and I pulled up a lot of those, videos that I've linked in the description, the different runs that I've done over the past, year. I actually rewatched a lot of those speedruns I did, and specifically looked for my thoughts after finishing the run on the various specs, because there were a lot of them that I'm like, I can, sit here months later and remember how it felt, kind of vaguely, to play all these specs. And I know generally their kit, how they work, right? Just off memory of years of playing this game. So I could pretty accurately put them, this is the tier that I think they would go in. But Hunter is really interesting, where I had to, specifically rewatch all three of those runs to get, my in-the-moment thoughts on what separates these three, so I can more accurately place them compared to everything else. And I think it is one of the more interesting classes to talk about in terms of the pure DPS classes, because I kind of mentioned earlier when talking about Frost and Unholy that it's really impossible to separate these two. No matter where I shift these around, they will always be right next to each other. Because while Unholy does its damage a little bit more through dots, and Frost is slightly direct damage, generally speaking, the way these specs play is kind of similar. It's, their speed at killing things is roughly the same. For Hunter, that is just not the case at all. I would say all three of these specs have significantly different playstyles. And even when we talk about, the other specs, Mage is a little bit samey, but we'll get to that. And, rogues and stuff, shamans. Whenever you have a class with multiple DPS specs, you may expect to see them, fall relatively the same. A little bit different with, obviously, Feral and Balance, because one is melee, one is ranged. But we have, two ranged specs and, obviously, one melee. And they share a lot of stuff, because they're all hunters, but they have very unique strengths and weaknesses. I guess we'll start with BM. We'll start in this order, sure. I'm going to put BM in... I have to put it ahead of Death Knights. I think I'm going to put it right here. I could see it being above Feral. And yeah, actually, I've convinced myself. It's above Feral. It is not better than Brewmaster, though. Brewmaster definitely is tankier. So, Beast Mastery Hunter, fun little lore behind this, channel lore, I guess. My first ever YouTube video that I ever uploaded was back in Shadowlands pre-patch. I got my first ever leveling world record with Beast Mastery Hunter. At the time, the way that the route worked out, with the knowledge that I had of different classes and stuff, I figured that a Volpera Beast Mastery Hunter would work best for speedrunning. And within like a few weeks, I had already figured out that Guardian Druid was just extremely busted, and I beat my same record within, I think, like literally 7 days, and I did it with a Guardian Druid. But early on, I actually thought Beast Mastery was really good because of its pet tank, and that is a very big strength. One of the unfortunate downsides of being a hunter, and I'm not going to penalize them too much, but this does really hurt them, is obviously being a pure DPS class. No matter what you're playing, you don't have access to tank queues. And especially as dungeons have become more and more integral to the routing, because, you know, when we've figured out that TPC dungeons are very good at low levels, that has become kind of a significant downside. And while your pet tank is good, obviously, at keeping, you know, yourself alive, right, in difficult situations, for the aforementioned Durnhold Elites and Yetimus, BM Hunter is one of the strongest classes for that. Its pet just tanks all the damage, and you press men pet. It isn't necessarily a massive advantage, and kind of your biggest strength, that being your pet tank, is in many cases also your biggest weakness, because pet AI in World of Warcraft is notoriously janky, and there are a lot of situations where if you need to like jump off a cliff, your pets are just running in this gigantic loop, and it takes them forever to get back to you. And when they're actually present, and you're actually, you know, keeping up your barb shot and doing multi-shot to maintain beast cleave, like they can do really good damage, but in many cases, it requires a ton of setup, and you're like spinning a bunch of plates to get the same damage as like a Havoc Demon Hunter or something, or the same damage as a Feral, except Feral obviously has its own problems. So it is good. It is really tanky because of the pets. It has pretty solid mobility, but nowhere near as good as like Monks or Demon Hunters. And it has good damage, but I would not say it is like really spectacular. Now, Marksmanship Hunter. This is an interesting one. Oh boy. Where do I put marksmanship? I know generally where I want to put it. I'm just thinking in the context of everything else. I'm going to put marksmanship right below balance. In fact, when I think about what I define as B tier, these are the two specs that I think are the quintessential B tier. The thing about marksman, though, is it's actually really weird the way that you build marksman. I would encourage you to watch like the linked video below if you decide you really want to level a marksman, despite the fact that, spoiler alert, it is going to be the lowest ranking hunter spec. It is still quite interesting playstyle. The problem with MM is Blizzard has heavily pushed this idea of playing with Lone Wolf. Now, in the past, when a lot of your damage was tied to being in like the Lone Wolf playstyle and not having your pet out, I would have put MM even lower, because you were really, really, really gimping yourself by not running with Lone Wolf. But then if you don't have a pet, Hunter is really not good, because Hunter does not have good survivability at all in terms of the Hunter itself. If you had no pets as Beast Mastery, obviously this would be one of the worst specs in the game. And we'll talk about survival, but survival also gets access to a pet, and it relies on its pet for many things. So your pet is, in many ways, the large part of your survivability as a hunter, because, well, it is not like your own personal survivability. You are letting your pet tank mobs for you, and then you are quickly healing up your pet to allow yourself to focus more on damage while your pet worries about doing the tanking. And in a Lone Wolf playstyle, you don't get that. And to make matters worse, if you are trying to play like the way that Lone Wolf encourages you to play, and like sit up these really long aim shots and stuff while mobs are hitting you, oh my god, it does not work. If there was like another button here for like Lone Wolf MM Hunter, it would be down here. I kind of said before, like if we're talking meme specs and stuff, I could technically put an F tier, and I think Lone Wolf MM Hunter would be an F tier. So that is why, like I said, if you want to play this, despite its ranking, I would highly encourage you to actually go watch the run that I did with MM and see the talents that I used, because it uses a pet for starters, but it uses a very non-standard talent build. Oh, speaking of pets, I actually had to pause my recording for a minute because my dog was barking very, very loudly. I'm assuming he stopped now, so I'll just continue. But if you heard barking in the background, that's why. But the thing about MM is it has a very non-standard talent build. If you look at the way that I play the vast majority of specs in a leveling context, I will make some slight adjustments compared to the endgame playstyle, but it is by and large the same. Like, there are some cases where I am just literally taking the Mythic Plus talent builds, the exact same thing, and running that for leveling, because leveling has a very AoE focused slant, right? It is much better to be pulling a bunch of mobs and cleaving them down than to be focusing on single targets. So there are certain different things. I would say a key one would be like Lunar Inspiration on Feral has not been a very popular talent lately, but I take it because having Moonfire in cat form as a pulling tool is really good. So sometimes there are very minor build differences like that. I believe I ran a very different build on Balance, but it's still played the same, but like I ran like Orbital Strike or something in my speedruns, and that worked wonders. It was fantastic. But a lot of my Boomkin friends were like, Orbital Strike, like that's really bad for endgame content. But sometimes talents that are not good for endgame are really good for leveling. MM is like, I am running the weirdest build that you would ever see if it was like an endgame raid or Mythic Plus scenario, but it is the best for leveling. And I spent a lot of time before I did my testing runs theory crafting like what the best possible MM build would be. And it requires using a pet. So I specifically don't take Lone Wolf, and I run everything that I can to basically turn MM into a BM Hunter light. But the thing about that is, I kind of said before, like Resto Druid, it has no advantages, so why would you ever play it compared to other stuff? Now, you could argue that if I'm just playing a worse version of BM Hunter, then MM should be further below. But MM actually has some advantages still, even with this kind of like weird janky setup running a pet, compared to BM and Survival. Namely, its AoE burst with Volley is actually kind of bonkers. It's like up there with a lot of the other top specs. That is unfortunately the only thing it has going for it. It still doesn't have great survivability because it's like, it has a shitty pet tank without all of the advantages of either Beast Mastery or Survival pet tank. So it works, but only kind of. It is still very immobile because you kind of need to press aim shot or the spec doesn't work, and aim shot is just a really, really, really bad ability to use while leveling. But if you do the proper burst setup, and you pull like an entire subzone, get your pet to hold threat for as long as possible, many times it'll die, and you have to be killing mobs as your pet is falling over, you can still cleave down massive amounts of mobs with like trick shots and stuff like that. And it is a pretty fun playstyle. I would say, though, a lot of the fun for me came from trying to make something extremely weird work as a leveling build, but it does work. So there is definitely an argument that I could put MM below, but I think the fact that you can make it actually work kind of on a comparable level to Balance, I would say it deserves to be here, I think. But it is worth noting that you cannot play with Lone Wolf. If you are playing with Lone Wolf, it is so much lower. This is with the kind of janky setup that I made that makes it kind of like BM, but not really. And finally, Survival, I would say goes right above Beast Mastery. Survival, this is going to be one of those like contentious ones where I know a lot of people really don't like Survival and hate the idea of Melee Hunter. And the nice thing is, as you can see here, they're very similar. They play very differently, I should say, but their strengths and weaknesses are surprisingly close, despite the difference in their playstyle. Survival still has a pet tank, but it has a lot of synergy with its pet. That means its pet is still pretty tanky. It's not as good as a Beast Mastery Hunter, but like, your pet can still solo tank Yetimus with absolutely no issue. I would say the biggest advantages of Survival is it has much better single target than Beast Mastery, and about the same AoE as the other two specs. Like, roughly all three are comparable in AoE. MM is slightly better in single target, but obviously really lacking in both survivability and mobility. BM is slightly lacking in single target, but really good at survivability. Survival is kind of just better at everything slightly. Better single target than, BM. About the same AoE, same survivability roughly, but the big thing is the mobility. The mobility and the fact that it's a melee and it doesn't have any cast times, and it can just jump in there, round up a bunch of mobs, get its pet to tank, and you're carving things and using Wildfire Bomb, it's really, really nice. And stuff like Harpoon, for instance, is just an added mobility spell that you do not get with the other two specs. So I get that a lot of Hunter players are playing the class because they want to use a bow. And if you really, really, really want to play that ranged playstyle, then just go with Beast Mastery. One additional note I should say is that BM is really easy to play. I'm not necessarily going to be rating a spec based on like how easy or hard it is. BM definitely has a skill ceiling, right? Like there are a lot of things that you can do to make BM really work well. But if you want a spec that can be played effectively by completely shutting your brain off, BM will do that. The other specs require some management, especially the janky MM build I have is like not easy to play. But survival is not the hardest thing ever. I think it's more just a lot of people I know will not want to play it because it is a melee hunter, but it is a very, very effective leveling spec. Nowhere near as broken as like Havoc, for instance, but it is still quite good. It has no real weaknesses. It is good at pretty much everything. The only downside to hunters in general is that they just don't have a tank spec, so they have slow queue times for dungeons. What can you do is what it is. But moving on to another class that is pure DPS and does not have any ability to get tank queues. We're starting off with one of the harder ones to rank, which I've said before, Arcane. This is one of the best leveling specs in the game. It's definitely not S tier. S tier is already locked down, but I do not know how to compare this to Havoc. And this is kind of one of those things where I've already said Havoc is insanely good. It is so hard to compare these two one-to-one. Oh boy, I'm going to go ahead and put Arcane above Havoc. So the thing about Arcane, and this is something where I remember there have been many times where I've been asked about mage leveling, and a lot of people really struggle with mage leveling. What you'll notice is a trend here. All of these mage specs are going to be very high ranked. Mage is very difficult to play properly. When I first started getting into WoW speedrunning, I tried leveling as a mage a few times, and it was not good. I historically am a tank player, and I've played melee DPS a few times, so when I transitioned into doing speedruns, aside from that one random BM Hunter run that was like the first video I ever posted on my channel, almost all of my runs were done with Monk and Druid, which are two classes that I have a ton of experience playing. And I am not a caster player. I've done all of my Mythic Plus, all my raiding for years as tanks and melee, so learning how to just play Mage from scratch and stuff as somebody even who is experienced with the game already is difficult, especially in a leveling environment. Because the way that you level as a mage, it's almost completely different than every single other spec in the game. Mages are, all of them, for that matter, extremely squishy. And we'll get to Fire. Fire may be one of the squishiest specs in the game. In fact, there is a literal PvP talent that you have to take for Fire if you want to make it work really well, called Glass Cannon. Literally, that is what it is. The thing about Mage, though, is it has some of the best mobility in the entire game and some of the best crowd control in the entire game. This has historically been the case for all Mage specs. Even like Frost back in like Vanilla WoW and stuff, and right now in Season of Discovery with the Arcane Mages and Living Flame and stuff like that, Mages have amazing crowd control. So while they are one of the weakest classes in terms of survivability, you should never be face-tanking mobs as a Mage. Your survivability as a mage comes from like the principle of if it can't hit you, then it can't do any damage to you, and therefore you are invincible. And in order to play properly, you are basically constantly moving, like with Arcane Mage, right? Go watch my Arcane run if you haven't seen how Mage works. It is ludicrously fun to play. I've thoroughly enjoyed all my recent Mage runs. Arcane is just constantly running, hitting Arcane Explosion, hitting Arcane Barrage, like with Chrono Shift, increasing your movement speed, slowing the mobs. It is just such a different playstyle, but man, does Arcane shine. It basically takes no damage, because if you do ever get hit, you have shields that can slightly absorb the damage you're taking, but you're rarely getting hit. Mobs can never reach you. You have insane AoE starting at low levels with Arcane Explosion into Arcane Barrage, so you're just melting entire packs. When you need to burn a single mob, Arcane does that phenomenally with like its major burst cooldowns, Arcane Power, etc. It is a very, 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 very powerful spec. It is borderline S. There, like I kind of said before, Havoc is like borderline S, Arcane is borderline S. There's like one other class that I'll talk about that I would put borderline S. The other thing that makes Mage really powerful is their portals. So being able to teleport like really quickly to Stormwind and like learn, or Orgrimmar also, and like learn your riding training, obviously not relevant anymore, but that historically was a thing. But right now, like turn on war mode, switch chromie times, expansions, etc. That is something that Mage can do very easily. And as I said, it's not nearly as impactful now, but it still is something to keep in mind. In fact, it could almost be considered an inherent advantage over other classes, especially for the Alliance side. Because for anyone unfamiliar with the current routing, on Alliance, Loch Modan is an insanely good leveling zone. But getting to Loch Modan is a little bit tricky. So all of my speedruns for Alliance will require some efficient way to reach Ironforge. That is like a major hurdle that you have to overcome, because you can only really get there normally by taking the Deep Run tram or flying over to Ironforge, like with a flight path, if you have the map that unlocks all of your flight paths. And basically being able to bypass that and get to Loch Modan really quickly is like a major time save in the context of these runs. And monks can't inherently do that, but Dark Iron Dwarves can be monks, so they can use their racial to immediately teleport to Ironforge. So all of my Alliance monk runs are done with Dark Iron Dwarf. Koltirans can unlock their portal room in Borealis as a Koltiran Druid and teleport to Ironforge, which is marginally slower than the Dark Iron Dwarf teleport, but still really fast, so it doesn't actually really lose time for being a druid. And then mages can just teleport straight to Ironforge. Like, there is no trick that you need to use. No matter what race you're playing, you can just do that. And it's really only those situations that let you do it. There's nothing else that lets you bypass it. So unless you are playing the specific races of Koltiran or Dark Iron for those racial abilities, in the case of Koltiran, the racial home capital that lets you get the portal room, Mage is the only one that has that skip. And while currently in this run, Ironforge is the only important teleport, obviously mages have portals to a ton of other major cities. And theoretically, if like 5 years from now, there is like a random major city, let's say you need to go to Pandaria. I don't know. Well, the only classes, I guess in this case, Monk would be able to get to Pandaria quickly, but Mage will always have that advantage. So this class in general, because of that, is kind of borderline S, because it is kind of the same thing of it can do everything well and it has this one key advantage. The only reason I can't justify putting it there is because it doesn't have tank Qs, which is, it's so close. It has insane damage. It has insane survivability because it can kite. It has insane mobility, which helps its survivability. And it has a key advantage, but it cannot Q as a tank. So you will never be able to get the same times that you can with Guardian Druid or Windwalker Monk or even really Havoc Demon Hunter. There's an argument to be made of putting Havoc ahead just because it can switch to Vengeance. But I think like when you compare them 1-to-1, I think Arcane is better. But not being able to queue as a tank just prohibits it from entering S tier, because whenever you need to queue for a dungeon, you have to wait as a DPS, and DPS is the worst queue time possible. Hell, even if it had a healer queue, if we had like Chronomancer like we do in SOD, that would make Mage S tier, I think, easily. But it can't go there otherwise. Speaking of which, for the other two specs, I think a lot of that applies to Mage in general. We kind of talked about Arcane, its strengths and weaknesses. I would put Fire right there. Fire, though, is... In fact, actually, no. I'm going to put Fire below Havoc. It is very good, though. I think the most fun that I've ever had testing a spec that I had not previously played was Fire Mage. So a lot of people who watched that stream where I was testing Fire Mage recently said they really enjoyed watching it because like my excitement was like infectious. I was loving the Fire playstyle, and Fire is like a spec that a lot of times in the past I haven't really played. Whenever I leveled as a mage, I always leveled as Arcane because I always knew it as the really good leveling spec. The way that the Dragonflight rework, as far as like how the talents go, has impacted Fire is amazing. It is... I want to put it up there with Arcane, and obviously it's close. Fire, as I said before, it is a complete glass cannon. You literally need to take a PvP talent called Glass Cannon. And I think one of the biggest issues with Fire is that whereas Arcane comes online almost entirely, it's full kit at like level 15 or something. You get it really early. You get Arcane Explosion almost immediately, and then you get your full kit by like the time you hit level 20. Fire, you kind of need to get to like level 30, level 35 for it to really feel powerful. And by the time you're in like the 50s or 60s, Fire is arguably stronger than Arcane because it does all of the same things Arcane does, but Fire just does ludicrous damage. You are pulling entire subzones and melting them in seconds. It is crazy. But Fire is so stressful to play. I was locked in when I was doing the testing runs for Fire because, oh my god, one slip up and you are just dead. If you blink the wrong way and you get caught with your pants down, you're fucked. If you don't do your burst correctly and you fuck up like your crit sequence, you're fucked. It is a very difficult to play in the context of like the stuff that you need to do for speed leveling spec, but when it all flows and works properly, god damn, it's like, it is art playing the spec. It feels amazing. You just feel like a fucking god playing a fire mage. It is so much fun. So I want to put the spec higher because the fun factor of it is right up there with like Havoc Demon Hunter in terms of like some of the most fun I've ever had doing leveling. But it does have the key weaknesses of, unlike Arcane, which is like really, really, really hard to fuck up, Fire is very difficult to play. But it can hit higher highs than Arcane at the higher levels. But, you know, I did say difficulty won't play a factor in, you know, the rankings, and it is not. I am ranking Fire below purely because it takes longer to get set up. So it is weaker at the lower levels, even if it is slightly stronger at higher levels. And that is a weakness, a notable weakness. I am more talking about the difficulty just as kind of a bonus contextual note for anyone who wants to try it. And finally, Frost. Frost is... It is definitely one of the least enjoyable specs that I've played. Compared to like how much fun I had playing Fire and how much I usually just enjoy playing Arcane, I just think Arcane is fun to play. I did not have a lot of fun playing Frost. It's not bad. It is definitely A tier, but it is nowhere near the top here. In fact, I would put it somewhere down here. I think let's put it here. This is a good spot for it. It kind of has a similar playstyle to the other two mage specs, but the damage is not there. Fire has the potential to be the highest damage leveling spec when played correctly. Arcane is just consistently very good for both AoE and single target throughout all levels, right up there with Guardian and Windwalker Monk, and both of them are extremely good at kiting. Frost is like... It has the same thing of its survivability is terrible, but if the mobs never hit you, then you don't take any damage. But the way the Frost achieves that is different than Arcane and Fire. And kind of the way that it achieves that also hurts it in the mobility department. So Arcane and Fire can blink around everywhere and just kite things and get like speed boosts and stuff. So you have like whatever the Fire thing is that increases your movement speed, and then Arcane gets like passive buffs whenever they Arcane Barrage. So they are really good at kiting, but they are also really good at moving from point A to point B, which is really important when you're leveling. If you're trying to like navigate an indoor area where mounts aren't available, then having really good mobility like shifting into cat form or using roll and flying serpent kick or using Arcane Barrage and blink and stuff, this is why a lot of these specs are really high up there for mobility reasons, because they can very easily traverse any area in the game while never worrying about losing damage or survivability. Frost is a much more turrety playstyle. It does the same things as Arcane and Fire by slowing the mobs so they can't reach you instead of outrunning the mobs. And when we're talking about survivability, it doesn't really change anything. The damage is tuned a little bit lower while leveling generally, which not enough to really bump it out of A tier. But I do think that the fact that its mobility is on the weaker end, not bad, mind you, it still has, you know, blink, shimmer, all the regular mage stuff, but it is missing a few key elements that make Arcane and Fire like, these are borderline S tier specs. Frost is not. Frost is just good. And if you really enjoy the way that Frost plays, it is perfectly fine, right? You can level with Frost and never break a sweat. It's a very safe leveling spec. I would definitely recommend it over Fire, for newer players who don't want to have this really hectic, stressful playstyle. But I think with like minimal understanding of how the game plays, it is not too hard to play Arcane and do like the kiting thing, you know, Arcane Explosion, Arcane Barrage. It's a pretty simple like builder spender playstyle that most people should be able to understand, even if they can't get like the most effectiveness out of it. But Frost is arguably a bit easier to execute than both of these playstyles when we're talking like speed running, rounding up a ton of mobs and blowing them up. So it's good, definitely A tier, but not quite as strong as the other two specs. But Mage in general, like, so far, this is the only class that all specs are in A tier. I think that says something about it. It definitely is just good across the board. Its class tree, its class basic utility is just phenomenal for leveling, kind of always has been. Now an interesting situation where maybe I should have just talked about Mistweaver earlier, but, you know, here we are. It's the final monk spec to talk about because we kind of already talked about Windwalker and Brewmaster, and unfortunately, it's going in C tier. It's actually our first C tier. So, I did say earlier one more healing spec will go into D tier. That's not Mistweaver. Mistweaver is really, really, really weird and hard to discuss for leveling. And whenever I talk about Mistweaver and its efficiency, a lot of people will bring up the fact that at levels 10 and 11, Mistweaver is one of the most powerful specs in the game. Unironically, yeah, this is just the way that World of Warcraft works. Leveling scaling is really weird at low levels and leads to some really odd situations where healers at low levels are scaled to be disproportionately stronger than DPS or tanks because Blizzard doesn't want like new players picking healer to feel like they can't kill anything out in the open world. So they get like large scaling modifiers when they are just starting out before they've gotten their kit. And Mistweaver Monk, all monk specializations for that matter, have access to Spinning Crane Kick, which is a really good AoE ability. So if you're playing Brewmaster, Spinning Crane Kick is something you'll use quite a lot. It's not the main source of your damage, but you're going to weave it in with other abilities. Windwalker Monk still in many cases uses Spinning Crane Kick, but it actually functions differently to Brewmaster and Mistweaver. So for Windwalker, Spinning Crane Kick is a spender that costs chi. So basically you attack a bunch of different targets, you build up it's something called Mark of the Crane, and then it causes your next Spinning Crane Kick to deal like a percentage more damage. So in the case of Windwalker, you're basically spending Spinning Crane Kick to deal like massive burst damage. In the case of Brewmaster Monk, it is different. It is a filler spell that you weave in with other stuff. In the case of Mistweaver, it is your only real damaging ability for hitting multiple targets. And that means that with your healing scaling, being able to spam Spinning Crane Kick at levels 10 to 12 will deal ludicrous damage. And there are videos out there that I'm sure you can find of level 10 Mistweavers just running through dungeons, holding W, pressing Spinning Crane Kick, and just soloing the entire instance, doing ludicrous damage with like OP twinked out setups. It is something that is possible. So I'm talking about this just to acknowledge that at those levels, it is something you can do. Here's the thing though, there are a lot of specs that can do that. We'll talk about Holy Priest later, but I think it is, when discussing how healer scaling works, it is impossible to mention Mistweaver without mentioning that Holy Priest can do quite literally the exact same thing, except they are doing it with Holy Nova, which is also healing the group. So it is just better. Right? Technically, monks have better mobility at lower levels, so they can do it ever so slightly faster because they can roll every so often. But Holy Priests are still doing that while keeping the group alive while never dying. So when we are comparing like how broken healing specs are due to their weird low-level scaling, you can't really say that Mistweaver is that much better than other ones. But I would feel bad if I didn't mention that because it is something that always comes up whenever I discuss Mistweaver. The problem is that is like literally all they have going for them. At low levels, they scale really well. At higher levels, maybe I shouldn't say it's the only thing they have going for them because they get some okay damage stuff in like the mid-tier levels, like level 30. And I really mean it's okay. It is not like amazing, but it is passable. It is enough to keep them out of D tier, is what I will say. They get Teachings of the Monastery, which lets them get like big blackout kick bursts, which, as far as healer single target damage, is on the slightly higher end. The problem with Mistweavers is for solo content, they just don't do that much damage. So you are going to do significantly less damage than both Windwalker and Brewmaster, which are both among the better specs in the game for solo content. And we've already said both of these specs are phenomenal at survivability. They can completely do that without reliance on healing spells, so Mistweaver does not have that as an advantage. In fact, I would actually argue that Mistweaver is less survivable than the other monk specs, despite the fact that it is a dedicated healer. Because obviously, Brewmasters have stagger. They can, even if they are a little bit squishy, they will stagger all of that damage and then heal it off later. Windwalker has Turbo Fists, allowing them to deflect all incoming damage. That is ludicrously powerful. So they have the ability to mitigate all of their incoming damage, even if their healing is slightly worse. Mistweaver has absolutely zero mitigation. You have no way to decrease your damage taken. So your only out is to continue spam healing yourself, and your healing is not actually turning into damage at all. You can either Spinning Crane Kick, or Blackout Kick, or heal yourself. You can't do all of them. It is not as bad as Resto Druid, which is the only reason that it is here, but I am struggling to think of a spec that I will put between these two, or at least between Mistweaver and the D tier, I guess, is a better way of wording that. This is bottom of C tier, literally. There is no spec that will go below this. It is borderline D tier. I am only putting it higher because at least at very low levels, its scaling is very good, but it is significantly worse than everything else, and it almost falls into the category of why would you ever play this? Speaking of which, there we go. So now, just kicking Paladin off with Holy Pally there. Holy Pally is the other spec that will go into the D tier. So if you guessed that, congratulations, you got the guess on what the other D tier spec will be. So now we have finalized 2 tiers of this list, if you don't count the Evoker tier. S tier is locked in, and now D tier is locked in. These are the only 2 specs that I'm going to be putting here, because Holy Paladin also just does not work for leveling, right? Its kit is not designed for leveling. It's honestly not even that good of a dungeon healer at low levels. It is possible that I am just really bad at Holy Paladin. In fact, I'm not a good Holy Paladin player, so I'm sure that in my tests I was not healing effectively, but I think there's something to be said for when I am able to play some of the other healing specs, which unfortunately all of the good healers we have yet to discuss. We've started with the bad healers. Take my word for it, all of the 3 remaining healers are significantly stronger than these. So kind of healers are getting a bad rep here for leveling. But any of these other 3 healing specs, which I'll discuss, I can kind of like press 1 or 2 buttons and keep the group alive, and, showing my hand a little bit here, but Holy Priest, you're mashing 1 button and you're topping damage and keeping everybody alive without like using any of your brain. So when I have to like bust my ass to just keep the group alive while healing dungeons as a Holy Paladin, and I am doing like kind of dog shit damage in the process, it is almost worse than Resto Druid. I don't know which one I would say is worse. I think I'm only putting Resto Druid behind because Holy Paladin at least does some passive damage while it is doing its healing, with like the Glimmer build and stuff. So you're setting up your Glimmers, and then you're, healing players, and your Glimmers are dealing passive damage to mobs, and you have some stuff like using your Judgment and Crusader Strike will give you synergy in your kit that increases your healing. And it's kind of one of those things where historically, in like endgame content, in raids and stuff, Holy Paladins have been one of the better damage healers. Obviously, Disc is like a dedicated, does damage and stuff, and there have been times where Resto Shamans have literally been built for damage, but that aside, Holy Paladins in many situations have been really good at passively doing damage while they heal. And that is something that kind of applies to leveling, but not really. And it is very similar to Resto Druid, where all of the stuff that you are using to deal damage, with the exception of Glimmer, is available to other classes. And in most of the cases where I was trying to do stuff as a Holy Paladin, the bulk of my damage came from Shield of the Righteous, which is a Prot Paladin ability. And Prot Paladins just do way more damage. So if you're gonna be like using Crusader Strike into Shield of the Righteous and Judgment and stuff like that and keeping up Consecration, why would you do that on a Holy Paladin? It has absolutely nothing going for it. It could even be argued that Protection Paladin is a better healer because of its like free Word of Glories and stuff like that, which, you know, I guess on that topic, up there. Protection Paladin is the other spec that I mentioned that is borderline S tier. It is, I would say compared to like these other specs, it is the tankiest leveling spec in the entire game by far. So Guardian Druid is really, really tanky, but there are times where your health will dip slightly as a Guardian Druid. Like, you can't really die, but in theory, there are sketchy situations. Like, technically speaking, there are areas in the world that are not part of the speedrunning route, but if for whatever reason they ever were included in a speedrun, a Guardian Druid may start to struggle, whereas Prop Pallies are completely unkillable in leveling when played correctly. They are a little bit harder to play, and by that I mean very little. Little bit harder to play than Guardian Druids, but oh my god, are they fun. They are, I think, I may have done as many Protection Paladin runs as I've done Guardian runs over, like, the many years that I've had my YouTube channel, and I have not done a single world record with a Protection Paladin because they're not an S tier spec, right? They cannot get world records. And yet I still do run after run of Protection Paladin just because I want to, because it is a fun spec to level. A lot of times if I'm testing out like new areas for my speedrunning routes for, you know, my leveling guides and stuff like that, instead of using a Guardian Druid, I may just do it on a Prop Pally, right? Because half the time you can still get valuable information on what is fast and what is slow, even if you're not playing the best specs in the game. And Prop Pally is just more fun to play, more fun to just, you know, press buttons and watch shit die. And on that subject, it is ever so slightly, and I mean like very, very, very slightly weaker in terms of mobility. Divine Steed is not the worst mobility spell in the game, but it's also not phenomenal. And if we're talking like crossing long distances, Prop Pallies will definitely struggle a little bit, or Paladins in general will struggle compared to a lot of the other specs. But it is not bad, right? They absolutely can cover like solid distances without really worrying about like being too slow. They're not Death Knights by any means. And the biggest thing for Prop Pally is damage. Prop Pally damage is, I would say, up there with fire, except it is not stressful at all. You just pull an entire zone, nothing can kill you, you round up mobs with Avenger's Shield, and especially like at lower levels, Avenger's Shield just kills things, Judgment just one-shots things, so single target Prop Pallies are better than both of these specs, and it's not even close, with the exception of like asterisks on that. Windwalker, when it gets Touch of Death, and can one-shot things with Touch of Death, is the best single target in the game. But Touch of Death is a really weird ability. So when you aren't able to rely on Touch of Death, Prop Pally has like some of the best single target while leveling, despite being a tank spec. And then towards like the middle levels, like 30, 40 and stuff, when it gets, I believe it's called Tears Enforcer, every time your shield bounces, it explodes and does like a burst of damage. What that means is that your damage starts to scale exponentially. So if you have like 10 mobs stacked on top of each other, every single time your Avenger's Shield bounces, that splash of damage hits 10 mobs. It bounces again, it hits one mob for a single bit of damage, but then it splashes onto 10 more mobs. And eventually you get Soaring Shield, which lets your shield hit 5 targets, up from 3, and then you're getting even more splashes of damage. And then at higher levels, I believe it's like level 45 or 50, you get Divine Toll, which fires off 5 Avenger Shields at once. So if you have a bunch of mobs stacked and you press Divine Toll, everything just gets instantly deleted. It is the most glorious thing that you can see while leveling. It is beautiful. Absolute art. So I really don't think that anything, even Fire, which like I said, has ludicrous damage output, Fire is probably, I think, when played perfectly, more single target than Protection, but AoE, it's just second to none. It just has no clear weaknesses. The only problem with Paladin, and this will be the same thing for Ret, I'll kind of just slot Ret in, I'm going to put it above Survival, and I'll discuss specifics on Ret in a little bit, but a lot of it is similar to Prot. Protection Paladin and Ret Paladin, they have no class advantage compared to anything else. So Druids have Flight Form, Monks have like Peak of Serenity stuff, Mages have teleports and stuff. Paladins, not only can they really not be the best races, they can be Dark Iron Dwarves. So if you're Alliance, that is an option, right? But other than getting access to Dark Iron Dwarf for the Ironforge teleport, they really don't have any of the good speedrunning utility that you want from your classes. So it's kind of that thing where they just can't go into S tier. They're really good. They have good mobility. They are unkillable. They have insane damage output. But that's just kind of it. They are just like, they are the definition of what A tier should be. They are good at everything. But they have nothing special that elevates them beyond that. So I have said for a very long time that I think Protection Paladins are the third best leveling spec in the game. They are just really good, and looking at this tier list now that I've finally gotten around to making it, I don't really think I would change my mind on that. I think it is pretty definitively, yeah, that's where I would put them. They're really good. One thing that I'm just noticing here, I am going to make this adjustment. I said it earlier, I will think about it. And I kind of thought this is where they would end up, just to kind of quickly touch upon why I'm moving Death Knights down. Their damage, when we look at all these other specs, they are, like, Frost has good AoE, but all of these specs have good AoE, right? Frost has weak single target. Unholy has good single target, but it does not compare to pretty much any of these specs. It has maybe better single target than, like, Feral Frost, BM, and Survival. I would say it beats these specs in single target, but all of these specs beat it in AoE, and they are infinitely better at mobility. Like Death Knight mobility versus Cat mobility, Death Knight mobility versus Mage mobility and stuff. So while they have like pieces of all of these specs, they are just kind of lacking in a lot of different departments. So I kind of thought that would be the case. I didn't want to like immediately lock them into B, because I think it is easier to explain why Death Knights deserve to go into B tier when you see everything else in A tier and understand like all of the strengths of all of these different classes. In fact, are there any other adjustments I want to make while we're at it? I don't think so. I'm actually quite happy with this. And on the topic of Ret Paladin is kind of like exactly the same thing as Prot Pally. The damage is good. I think single target, it is slightly better than Prot Pally. It has more like single target burst. It is weaker in AoE, which I think is notable. Prot Pally with Tears Enforcer is just, like I said, the king of AoE damage while leveling. It is nutty. And Ret Paladins are going to have to switch to Prot for dungeons anyways. Not that you would feel bad about it, because Prot is just insane for dungeons. You pull the entire dungeon up to a boss, cleave it all down with like Divine Toll, and then move on to the next boss and do the same thing. Prot is insane for dungeons. It is the single best dungeon tank out of all of them. Not even close, I should add. It is notably better than Bear in dungeons, but Bear is like the second best, and obviously Bear has better mobility going to and from bosses, so they're like comparable, I would say. But the main thing about Ret is just its survivability is weaker. It's not bad. Like, Ret will never die. Ret will never be in a situation where you're like, oh man, I really can't handle this. You have good self-healing and stuff, but like when you are healing yourself to stay alive as a Ret Paladin, it in many cases like causes you to slow down your damage a little bit, whereas Prot Pally, just half the time you don't even need to heal yourself, and when you do, you're getting a free Word of Glory, because like, I forget what the passive is, but after you've done enough Holy Power Spenders, your next Word of Glory is completely free. So you just never need to worry about survivability, even when you are in danger. And then you have cooldowns, which half the time you don't even need to use. You have Divine Shield, which Ret does have that too. Paladin just has an insane amount of tools. It is a shame that Holy Paladin just has nothing going for it, because Paladin in general, it's like a fun class to play, but it's kind of one of those things where like, what does Holy Paladin bring that Ret and Prot don't? Yeah. And I don't know, I'm looking for more stuff to say about Ret, but Ret is kind of, it'll likely end up being smack dab in the middle of A tier. It has absolutely nothing special about it. It's just good. There's really nothing I can say. Divine Steed, okay mobility. It has good AoE damage, good single target. It has good survivability. It is like definitive A tier. There are no strengths, no like defining strengths like any of these other specs. No defining weaknesses at all. It is just there. right? There's nothing bad that I can say about it, but it is also very not exceptional or noteworthy. But for the other specs, this is going to be an interesting one. So, if you had asked me back in Shadowlands to make this tier list, like where would I rank Priest? I probably would have put all pre-specs down here. I would have said, I maybe would have put Holy in B tier. But I would have said, I might have even put Disc in B tier. But I would have said Shadow is one of the worst leveling specs in the game. Priest just doesn't really work for leveling. And I think that it is quite possible that Priest, out of all of the different leveling classes, has benefited the most from the Dragonflight talent changes. Oh my god, what a glow up. All 3 Priest specs are going to be in A tier. All of them. They all deserve to be here. Oh my god, this class is just absolutely shattered my expectations. So the only thing I need to figure out is where they fall. And what's so interesting about this is these specs, Holy and Disc are kind of the same, but Holy and Shadow, or the healers in Shadow, have very different playstyles, but just the way that they work, they are both very strong kind of for their own reasons. So for starters, Priest mobility is not insane, but it is pretty good. And one of the nice things about Priest mobility, aside from like Angelic Feather, which like is fine, but just not very fun to use, Body and Soul, I think all Priests get that, but it's nice because you're basically getting survivability and mobility from one spell, which is always good whenever you get to bundle things and like save your spell casts. And, you don't feel bad using Power Word Shield, right, to get that speed boost, because you're also getting a shield that you can then use to absorb damage. So it feels nice to get like a 2-for-1 bonus. And I would say like for Shadow, they also have like some self-healing effects and stuff, but Shadow has a lot of instant cast abilities and like a lot of dots and stuff that it can put on mobs. So it's able to very easily now with the right build. You have to run like a very specific build. It's been a hot minute since I played Shadow Priest, so I don't remember exactly what talents I ran, but I remember it was a lot of instant cast stuff. It was basically a lot of like 30-second to 1-minute cooldown abilities, and I would pull a bunch of mobs and then just press all these like mini cooldowns and blow them up. Just like Shadow Crash, Void Eruption, and like whatever the like little beam that you channel is, and just everything explodes and it dies. So you round up a bunch of stuff, like put Shadow Word Pain out on a bunch of mobs, and then just gigantic explosion of damage. One of the other things, I would say, my single favorite class talent of really any class is Rhapsody in the Priest tree. Rhapsody means that, or it makes it so over time, your Holy Nova will stack up and increase damage and healing buff. So even while leveling, Shadow Priest will be using Holy Nova as a damage button. It is that good. So when Rhapsody hits its maximum amount of stacks in AoE, Shadow Priests will press that. And a lot of times it'll be like either your top damage or your second damage. And it's Holy Nova, a healing spell, so you also get a big burst of healing from that. So that is like the single strongest thing in the Priest kit right now, and it is the main reason why all of them are in A tier, because Holy Nova is just such a ludicrously broken ability for all 3 specs, even Shadow, and it carries their survivability. All 3 are good at kiting, so it's similar to Mage, how it plays, where you're kiting mobs, so you never really take damage, and they're all putting out like massive amounts of damage. I would say, I don't know, I think they're probably going to be on the bottom of A tier mostly. I would put them ahead of... Ooh, how do I rank this? I think I put Shadow here. And where do I put the healing priests? I think they're above. It's got to be like around here. I don't know if I put them above Hunters. I think I do. I think yeah, I put them above Hunters. And I'll go with this. I want to put Holy ahead, just because Holy is slightly stronger at lower levels, but it's kind of like the Mistweaver thing. Disc is like still really good at lower levels. Holy is up here for like level 10. Same with Mistweaver. But it is still really good, but I think Discipline is consistently about as good as Holy, and at the higher levels, it gets a little bit more in its kit. There is like a period towards the middle section of the leveling process from like levels 20 to 35 or so. Whenever Holy gets, I believe it's like Imperial Blaze, where you press this button and your next 3 Holy Fires are instant cast and do like massive damage. That turns Holy Priest into like one of the best leveling specs in the game for like the next 10 levels, because you press that and you just delete everything in your path. If you are healing dungeons as either one of these specs, if you are playing correctly, it is not uncommon for you to be literally the top damage as a healer if you know what you're doing. They do monstrous amounts of damage. Like, it should not be possible to do this much damage as a healer. It is crazy strong. And they are both extremely comparable because they both rely a lot on Holy Nova spamming, especially at lower levels for AoE. But whereas Holy Priest is still a little bit weak on single target because it has to rely on Holy Fire and like Holy Word Chastise, I believe it's called, to do like single target damage. Disc Priest, as it levels up, fleshes out its single target kit a little bit more. So I would say that it pulls ahead, ever so slightly ahead of Holy Priest. And you know what? I'm actually going to put Shadow up ahead of Rep Pally. I think that's probably a good place to put it. Because, like, the thing is, these healing specs, they do crazy damage. They are not going to be doing as much damage as any of these. I could even see... now I'm like, do I put Shadow ahead of Brewmaster? Brewmaster's good, but like... yeah, you know what? I've convinced myself. It's good, but it's like, Shadow feels really broken. It's not ahead of Fire, though. I think that's where I'll leave it. The other thing about Priest is it's kind of like Paladin, it has no special class utility, so I don't really think it compares to these ones. It does like maybe the same damage, Shadow, as like a lot of these other ones. It just deletes packs. It never struggles in survivability. It has pretty solid mobility, but its mobility is notably weaker than like mages and demon hunters, definitely monks. The only reason I'm putting it ahead of Brewmaster is like, well, Brewmaster may be slightly tankier and have slightly better mobility. Shadow Priest does notably more damage. I would actually rather play Rep Pally than Brewmaster for solo leveling. I think Brewmaster's damage is definitely an issue. I think I should take a moment before I move into... Rogue is going to be a very interesting topic. I'm looking at the time on this video. I hope you're enjoying watching this because, oh boy, this is a long one. But it's kind of why I've delayed making this video for so long. There is so much information to cover, and this is the result of literally years of research. Every single one of these runs takes hours. And a lot of times there are days of setup and research that goes into each one of those runs. So there is so much effort that goes into what has led me to this tier list. And of course, the tier list itself. I'm only doing this once for Dragonflight. I'll probably do this again with the War Within. But I want to make sure I get it done well. And I think for the A tier, I like Brewmaster more than these two. Like, Priest damage is good, but it's not, like, that good. And, yeah. Like, obviously, you still have tank Qs and stuff, so I'm happy with this. And I think, yeah, both Hunters feel relatively comparable. I definitely want the Hunters above the Frost Mages. I'm actually going to go ahead and do this. I think... We kind of already talked about Feral Druid, but I think the more... like, I was already teetering. I went in knowing Feral Druid would be bottom of A tier, but... its survivability is kind of an issue. I talked about it before of how kiting allows you to kind of bypass the survivability issue, but it does take like considerably longer to kill off mobs, and its single target damage is like notably a little bit weaker in that it has to rely on cat form. So I don't know. It's not bad. I would say you could justify either one, but if we really have to split hairs, I think it has a few too many glaring weaknesses, and it's kind of similar to Boomkin in that regard of, like, why would you play this relative to Guardian? So I feel comfortable dropping it there. I may, as time goes on, bump Frost Mage. In fact, you know what? I've convinced myself. In fact, I'm actually going to move Frost below Feral. I think both of these are fine. So Mage has been dethroned from having all 3 specs in A tier. You know, I'm sure some people will argue, it's unfair to change it later on, but this feels right to me. I am entirely guilty of the mindset of I like to balance out like the different trees and stuff and make it so every single like it feels more well-rounded. I'm also going to go ahead and move Blood Decay down. Blood Decay, we've already discussed it. It feels significantly worse to level completely solo than both of these specs. I'm fine Vengeance Demon Hunter keeping it where it is though. I would rather play this than these two, but definitely not as much as these. This feels good, I think, reshuffling it around. But yeah, I think we thoroughly discussed Priest. It's one of those where there's not really a lot more to say about it than we've already touched upon. Shadow Priest is just really good. It's not like as flashy, I should say, compared to some of the other specs, in that its main advantage does come from what I said of like the low cooldown abilities and being able to just press everything on every single pull. And it has pretty good single target damage and definitely Rhapsody though. Without Rhapsody, all three of these specs would be considerably worse. So if for whatever reason Blizzard ever heavily nerfs that or removes it and makes it like Holy Priest only or something, Shadow would drop down quite significantly. But the power of Holy Nova with Rhapsody hard carries Priest just as a class. And I feel very confident putting it in A tier because of that. All three of them. And that I definitely won't change. I could maybe see BM Hunter dropping into B tier by the end of this tier list. I don't know if it will, but I could see it. But I think Survival and then by association the rest of these specs, this is where I would lock in A tier. None of these will go below it. Survival Hunter is definitely A tier. Even if it is like not as insanely flashy as some of the other ones. Okay, time to talk about rogues. So, rogue is the worst leveling class in the game by far. For sure. This is something that I have discussed at length. If you go watch all three of the rogue speedruns, which were done quite recently. So I saved rogue for last. I'm not going to check the exact dates, but basically over the month of November, when I was like kind of wrapping up all of these testing runs, I did a run with each three of these in a stream. And I've tested various specs of Rogue in the past. I actually did a fresh account run with Outlaw, like about a year ago or something. It's been quite a while by now. Actually, I forget it. Maybe it was only 6 months. My timeline is screwed. But yeah, I tested Rogue in the past, so it wasn't just these last 3 runs, but I did them back to back just to really show the strengths and weaknesses of each one of these specs. And Rogue has never really been that great for leveling in like modern WoW expansions. It has always kind of felt like it's been left behind because as time has gone on, even the worst specs for like, dealing damage and stuff in like a leveling context have always felt like they have some way to stay alive. Like I said before, Boomkins, they kind of need to like spam heals on themselves to live, but they have that option. They can keep themselves up. Same with marksmanship hunters. Like they can use a pet and gimp their damage, but they have the option to keep themselves alive by doing that. Blood DKs, or not Blood DKs, Frost and Unholy can spam Death Strike and sustain themselves. But certain rogue specs simply do not have survivability options. They have evasion, they have, with a PvP talent, Cloak of Shadows gives you 100% dodge, and they have Crimson Vial. Crimson Vial is the single worst healing ability in the game. It is laughably undertuned. And one of the problems with Rogue is I'm sitting here saying that Rogue survivability is terrible, and anybody who like knows how rogues are in endgame content and doesn't really care about leveling is probably very confused right now. And this is kind of the issue of rogues and why I think they will always struggle with leveling stuff. In endgame content, rogues are one of the hardest to kill DPS, because cheat death allows you to just survive mechanics that other classes can't. And rogues have really good things like Feint, lets you avoid AoE damage, so if like a raid boss is doing a really hard-hitting ability, you press Feint and you just negate half the damage. Cloak of Shadows lets you negate like a really hard-hitting magic ability. Evasion lets you face tank mobs for a while. Rogues have insane cooldown-based survivability. And most of the damage patterns in high-level difficult content are built around that. So rogues are like uniquely situated to be almost unkillable in harder endgame content, but that same strength is a massive weakness for leveling because as a result, they have very little sustained survivability. Their self-healing is terrible. They have basically nothing. There are some specs that we'll talk about that can get access to not good survivability, but like at least options that let them stay alive through some of the harder pulls. But no matter how you slice it, a lot of the most difficult pulls that you can do in speedruns that I will do regularly on Guardian Druid and Windwalker, you simply cannot attempt as a rogue. You will die. Or if you don't die, you will have to burn through all of your survivability cooldowns to live it, and then you'll just have to sit on your thumbs for like 5 minutes or something while you wait on that. So realistically, the way that you're forced to level as a rogue is to just go at a slower pace and take like more bite-sized pulls. So you can like kind of weave your cooldowns like from pull to pull instead of having to blow them all sequentially in one giant sitting, which ultimately will end up slowing you down. Whereas things like that, Guardian Druid, Windwalker, they can do with ease. So with that being said, this is a problem that plagues the entire class, and even the recent rework, unfortunately, did not really solve it. I'm going to put all of them in where I think they belong, and we'll talk about it. Let's put it there. Okay, so this goes above Mistweaver, though. Mistweaver is definitely worse. Let me just look ahead just to be sure. Yeah. In fact, I'm debating just removing D tier and moving this up because I will give you a spoiler. No other spec from here on out is going to land in C tier. This is all we have. In fact, you know what? I'm just going to do that. Oh, I accidentally swapped it. Can I delete row? Okay, and then it just bumps it down. I'm just going to do that. I think just keep in mind that like Holy Paladin and Resto Druid are notably worse than these two, but I actually think it's a little bit weird to have two different tiers. I kind of thought I would put more specs in there. Historically, I would have bumped a few more specs down into C tier, but I want to more clearly like demonstrate the relative power levels, and like if a spec doesn't have any massive glaring weaknesses, I don't want to put it in C tier just to round it out. So I think this is probably a better way of doing it. This will be our final C tier, though. I think Assassination is, there's an argument to be made of putting it in C tier. I am probably going to put it in B tier just to demonstrate how much better it is than Outlaw. Outlaw is going to be the only damage specialization, or honestly, the only non-healer that I would put in C tier. It is really bad. It does not work. The worst part about Outlaw, by far, is that Blade Flurry is the only way that you get access to AoE, and it's a cooldown. It's kind of one of those things where, like, I get how it might work in endgame, and I've been told that, like, the way that Outlaw works in endgame content is Blade Flurry is effectively 100% uptime when played correctly. I don't really play Outlaw, so I can't speak to that personally, but I have friends who play it, and whenever I talk to them about this issue, they're like, oh, well, that's not really an issue in dungeons or raids, etc. In leveling situations, the way that Outlaw works is you press Blade Flurry, you get AoE for a few seconds, and then you have literally no buttons that hit multiple targets. You are a pure single target DPS in a form of content that heavily favors AoE. And it just does not work. That does not work. Outlaw has so many glaring weaknesses. It has really no strength. The only moderate strength of Outlaw is it has like okay mobility. It has like mobility on the level of Survival Hunter, kind of with like Harpoon, or well, it's Grappling Hook, I would say is comparable to Harpoon. The thing about Grappling Hook is it's actually just such a dog shit ability. I hate Grappling Hook. Half the time I use it, it just disappears and I don't go anywhere. And I've heard it has something to do with like line of sight to the connecting point of your Grappling Hook. All I know is that there have been countless times where I am trying to use Grappling Hook to get away, and I toss it, it vanishes. I'm sitting there just absolutely fucked, and I have nowhere to go while mobs kill me. And I have nothing left, and I just die. It is the most miserable leveling experience I have ever done, and I've done it a few times now. I've actually played Outlaw more than the other rogue specs, partially because it is so much worse than all of the others that whenever in the past I put up a poll of like, what should I level as, my viewers all vote for Outlaw because they're like, yeah, let's watch him suffer. So we get to watch like 7 hours of him complaining and being miserable because, you know, suffering is fun. But that also means that I would like to think that I have tried everything to make Outlaw work, and it just doesn't. It does not fucking work. This is such a terrible leveling spec, and I don't know how to fix it without like a complete rework. But I've been told that, you know, people like the way it works in endgame. I haven't even talked right about like the RNG aspect of it, which, I mean, need I explain why having a huge portion of your damage tied to random chance with roll the bones and stuff is just terrible design? I dislike that in general. While leveling it feels even worse. Oh my god, I just hate Outlaw. It's so bad. And I should note it's also just like a known fact, right? Like multiple rogue players I know have said that they can't stand playing Outlaw for leveling, even though they like it for endgame. It's just the spec does not function. It's bad. In terms of like the specs kit doesn't work for leveling, it's kind of in the same boat as these other specs, which is why I feel it fits there. The thing is, because it is a DPS spec, it is, of course, tuned to hit harder than the other ones, but hell, you can make an argument that Resto Druid, going into Boomkin form, could do more damage than Outlaw. I don't know for sure. I'm not going to sit here and test that crap, but it's really just not great. And Assassination, while not good, is notably stronger than Outlaw because it has AoE. It has, what is it, Shuriken Storm, or I believe it's just Fan of Knives, and Shuriken Storm is like the subtlety version. And it has the ability to hit multiple targets, though not very good. So I've kind of already talked about how survivability is a glaring issue for all these specs, and that holds Assassination back a lot. It is able to do damage far more effectively in both single target and AoE than Outlaw. In fact, the difference in single target damage between Outlaw and Assassin is massive. The AoE is not great here. It's still kind of whatever, but it is notably better than Outlaw 2, but at least Outlaw, when it has Blade Flurry up, does really good AoE damage. Outside of that, it's terrible. But Outlaw single target is dog water. It is just so bad. Assassination, with all of its cooldowns, can do considerably good burst damage. And as far as damage goes, I would actually put Assassination like up here with like the Death Knight specs. And like Subtlety, you know, we can move on to that now. Subtlety, I would actually say damage-wise, it competes with a lot of the better specs. It's probably up here if we're talking pure damage. And I know some people may say, well, like, is survivability really that big of an issue? Do you really have to heavily punish these specs? Yes, because when you are playing this in a realistic speedrunning setting, your survivability will impact your damage. Because if I am sitting there pumping out damage, you know, in a vacuum, right? Like, I can hit high numbers in a leveling setting. You're still, even in perfect conditions, you're not going to be doing the damage of these specs. No matter how good you are at playing Rogue, it just doesn't work from a leveling perspective. But the issue is, if I'm playing Assassination and I start getting pounded and I'm taking a ton of damage, well, I can't just sit there and keep doing damage. Whereas a Ret Paladin could just press a heal, or Shadow Priest presses Holy Nova with Rhapsody and continues doing damage. With Assassination, well, suddenly you need to kite. And unlike Fire Mage and Arcane Mage and stuff, which are god tier kiters, Arcane just runs around, presses Arcane Explosion and stuff, and does its full damage rotation while kiting the mobs. You cannot do that with Assassination Rogue. You need to be in melee. It is a melee spec. You need to be hitting the mobs, you know, with your weapons to do your damage. And if you are running away from them, the most you can do is spam Fan of Knives, like at max distance, and basically play store brand Arcane. And it kind of works. Like, if you really want to make it happen, you can passably level as Assassination, but you really start to feel the downside of it. It's very, very bad. I think if Rogue somehow gets better survivability, it would single-handedly fix at least both of these specs. Assassination still wouldn't be amazing. It would be like around where Feral Druid is, like maybe top of B tier, if survivability wasn't that bad. Subtlety would actually be a pretty good spec. Like if Subtlety was able to have the same really good mobility that it has, the same damage that it has, which it is while leveling the best of the 3 specs, because it can do very good single target burst, and it has really good AoE damage as well. It would be up there. I would say Subtlety, fix its survivability problem, it's A tier. But this just really holds it back. And the thing about Sub, additionally, Sub has the best survivability out of the 3 rogue specs. That is why even within B tier, there is a gulf between these 2 specs. That is due to the survivability difference. But Sub is still fairly squishy. It is nowhere near as tanky as a lot of these other specs. It is still really, 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 really squishy, and you need to play around that. But it has better defensive stuff. It has a lot of better passive healing, and that's the main thing. So there are times where as Sub, you will still need to kite, but because of Sub's passive healing from, like, it has better leech, it has, I forget what it is, there's like some passive effects where when you use certain abilities, you restore like a percentage of your health. And it's very low, it's not a lot, but what that means is that over time, you'll be able to last in combat for longer, doing your damage before you run out of health and need to run away before you die. So Sub will be able to hold its own for a little bit longer, and in many cases, that extra bit of time will mean a world of difference, because let's say if you're able to hit mobs for 30 seconds consecutively, just to pick a random number, they will be dead and you'll be able to quickly heal and move to the next pull. Because the moment you get out of combat, if you're leveling properly, you have food items, you can quickly eat, and then you restore your health. Ideally, you have better self-healing options in your class's kit, but if you don't, you can always rely on food. And rogues will need to heavily rely on food. So the moment the mobs are dead, you can heal and move on to the next pull. So if we're in a situation where, let's say, both rogue specs, like you're playing Sub and Assassination, both of them can do an insane amount of damage and kill the mobs within 30 seconds. And that is how long it takes them to kill them off. But Assassination, after 20 seconds, starts to run out of health. Well, now Assassination rogues need to start running. And as they're running, their damage is dropping off dramatically. They're having to like kite with Fan of Knives and continue spamming Crimson Vial to heal themselves just a tiny bit, ever so slightly, so they can finish it off. By the time those mobs are dead, it's taken them like 50 seconds to do the rest of that damage while kiting those mobs. Whereas, like, if you have slightly more healing as Subtlety, if it lasts you like 10 more seconds to finish off those mobs, you may end the pull at like 5%. But if you're able to kill them in that 30-second window before you're forced to start kiting, then you can quickly heal, enter the next pull, and you save time. So, I don't know if I did that explanation well enough, but even a small amount of self-healing can make a significant difference if it lets you kill mobs within that time. Unfortunately, there are still situations where that will not be enough for Sub, and they will be forced to kite, so I cannot put them any higher than here, really. But they are notably better than these other 2 specs. Assassination, the last thing that I want to say, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. They are really, really, really bad at tagging mobs from levels like 1 to 19. So a lot of other specs have things like, let's say, Moonfire. Moonfire is the classic, easy to tag mobs with ability that makes Guardian Druids so nice for leveling. You just Moonfire a million different mobs, round them up, and kill them. Paladins have like Judgment, and Avenger's Shield can tag a bunch of stuff and round them up. Mages have a ton of options. Havoc Demon Hunters have Throw Glaive, Ricochets, and stuff. There's a lot of things that you can use. And even Outlaw, at low levels, has Pistol Shot. So you're running around, you're pistol shotting mobs, you're dragging them towards you so that you can hit them. And Outlaw kind of has a weird issue where Pistol Shot is a generator at low levels, and at higher levels, Pistol Shot turns into one of your biggest sources of damage with Fan the Hammer. So it actually, at high levels, Outlaw has the same issue that Assassination does at low levels, where the only reliable tagging option you have becomes something that is so crucial to your damage that you can't use it to tag mobs, because if you're spending your Fan the Hammer procs on starting a pull, then you're going to end up with like most of your burst gone by the time everything's rounded up. Outlaw has some serious issues. This spec needs attention for leveling. I don't know what they can do to fix it, but it really needs attention. But at lower levels, Assassination has nothing. It just has absolutely nothing that can tag mobs. I think Sub has like Shuriken Toss or something. So it's not like an amazing ability, but it at least lets them tag mobs from a distance. I think Assassination is one of the only specs in the game melee specs in the game that is, I guess, kind of redundant because range can obviously tag from a distance. But it is, I think, the only melee spec that has no way to drag mobs close to it or to like close the distance. So you spend a ton of time at low levels as Assassination just running up to mobs so you can stab them. And then at, I think, level 19, you get Poison Dagger Throw. Or I forget what the name is, but you throw a dagger and you apply your poisons. Why is it level 19? I don't get that. It's like it is the typical low-level tagging ability, and you just randomly get it at like a section kind of a little bit into the leveling process. It's not terrible. It's early enough that it doesn't really impact their leveling, but it's just annoying because it's a problem that no other spec has. To give you an idea, I go watch the Assassination run. It's funny as fuck, the solution that people in chat came up with. Somebody recommended that I get a toy, which I happen to have, but use a toy from my toy box where you throw a fruit at an enemy. It's like some fruit basket, and it has like a 20-second cooldown or something, but it throws a fruit that does 0 damage, but at least gets the mob to attack you. So I was literally spending the first 10 levels of the Assassination run chucking fruit at enemies to get them to get in combat with me so they would run towards me, and that would like lower the distance that I had to run to reach them to stab them. It is a ridiculously just comical problem to have, and I don't know, it definitely sucks. It's the kind of thing where it's not going to make or break the leveling process, but like, that's the thing that really shouldn't be the defining factor on why this spec is worse. So I do hope that that gets changed over time. It's easy. Just make Poison Blade like a level 10 ability that you get by default, and that solves the entire problem. So that alone, I would say if that problem was solved, I'd probably just give them a token bump above Blood DK just to say like, at least they're not that bad. But I can't justify anything but bottom of B tier with how they currently are. Okay, now that we've spent a lot of time discussing Rogue. So, Elemental, Enhance, and Resto. Elemental and Enhance are, I would say, fairly similar. They're both going to be... Enhance is A tier. I can lock that in. In fact, where do I want to put it? I would say Enhance is almost indistinguishable from Brewmaster Monk. Or, not Brewmaster, Retribution Paladin. Like, everything that I said about Ret Pally of... They do good damage, they have good survivability, they have good mobility. That is Enhance. It does absolutely nothing special. It just has good single target, it has good AoE, it has, like, Astral Shift, instant cast healing surges, Ghost Wolf is just a good mobility spell. Not much to say. It's a good leveling spec, it does nothing special, it has no weaknesses. It is... These two specs are so similar in terms of how they play and how they level and like their strengths and weaknesses, etc. Elemental is also good, but when I did my Elemental run, I spent, I think it was like an hour and a half before starting the run looking at talents and like talking to Elemental players in chat, trying to understand how the fuck I was supposed to play the spec. Because it's like you need a fucking PhD to understand Elemental Shaman. It is so complicated. There are so many like interactions with your talents and just basic kit and stuff. And when I figured it out, it felt pretty good. Like, I think I killed Yetimus really quickly. I just pressed Stormkeeper and then I got like a million lightning bolts and Yetimus just got erased from existence. I didn't even take damage. Like, he hit my Earth Ellie twice and then he just died. So, Elemental has insane burst potential. But it is not going to be above these. I think I'm going to put it above Survival. I think that's a good spot. At higher levels, Elemental is maybe slightly stronger than Enhancement in terms of raw damage output. It gets like these ridiculous like echoing chain lightnings that just erase AoE, echoing lightning bolts that delete single target mobs. it has ludicrous power spikes when it gets access to its full kit, but it is notably weaker at lower levels. It's not bad. It is like maybe somewhere like down here in the lower levels, and it's like up here when you get like all your really good stuff, maybe. But it is, and that's purely for damage, I should note. But it is very, very, very good. The survivability is kind of the same. It's about the same as Enhancement. Enhancement obviously can kite a little bit better because Elemental is very turrety. You have to sit there and cast your Lightning Bolt, your Chain Lightning. Earth Ellie and stuff like that helps for some of the more difficult pulls. Ghost Wolf is nice mobility, so it has that going for it. But yeah, they're both very good specs. I would say if you are a new player, definitely do not play Elemental. While it is a fun spec, and I know a lot of people will love it, and I can see why, it is not a new player spec. It is, especially while leveling, you still need to understand a lot of the interactions, whereas like a lot of the other specs, you can kind of just press buttons and damage will happen. That is not the case here. You very much need to understand the interactions to get it to work while leveling, and it can work really well, but it is not very easy, whereas Enhance is pretty much you just kind of press the buttons that light up. It's pretty straightforward. So, yeah, not too hard. And last but not least, Resto Shaman. So, Resto Shaman is not Holy or Disc Priest. It's definitely not one of these two. But it is good. It's definitely not these. It is a very interesting healer where at lower levels, I would say, obviously, we've talked about like Holy Priest, Disc Priest, and Mistweaver Monk are ludicrously broken. They can like both mash one button and do insane damage, almost more than any other spec in the game. And that continues for quite a bit, all the way up until like kind of level 20, level 25. And while I would say they are kind of in their own league, Resto Shaman is very good. Resto Shaman also has really high damage at lower levels with Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt, and it gets pretty good stuff early on, like in the very first few talents of its spec tree, that actually boost its damage. So it gets like Acid Rain, which makes Healing Rain do damage to anyone standing inside of it. It gets some boost to its Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning damage, so it actually continues getting stronger as it levels up, unlike, you know, these other specs, which, while they are kind of good at low levels, they fall off really hard. One of the problems with Resto Shaman is, actually, as of like 5 months ago, I would have put it like a bit higher up here. Recently, for whatever reason, I mean, I kind of know the reason, it sucks. Blizzard made it so a lot of the Primordial Wave synergy in the bottom section of Resto Shaman spec tree only affects players. It does not affect enemies. So historically, back in Shadowlands and stuff, when it was a Covenant ability, Primordial Wave is like this big chain heal / chain lightning that would heal players and deal damage to enemies, and it stayed like that, you know, when it turned into a Dragonflight talent, and it still works like that for, I know Elemental gets it, I don't know if Enhance gets it, maybe they do. Either way, it works like that for the damage specs, where it'll deal damage to enemies and then sometimes heal allies. And it used to work like that for Resto Shamans. So what would happen is they would never be doing as much as Priests. They were never that good. But they would be doing good damage at low levels. They would start to fall off, and then they would get Primordial Wave. And Primordial Wave was really, 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 really powerful. And it kind of gave them like a second wind in the later levels that let them be very strong. Unfortunately, in the most recent patch, I think it was literally patch 10.2, made it so Primordial Wave for Resto now doesn't do damage to enemies. So they just kind of hit a wall at like level 25, 30-ish, where they stop getting any benefit from their talents as far as their damage output goes. And like, they're perfectly fine healers. You can do a ton of healing as a Resto Shaman. Your group is never in concern if you're, you know, doing a dungeon. If you're doing solo stuff, they're perfectly fine for keeping themselves alive. They do still really good AoE and single target with Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolts, but while they have some of their own like strengths at lower levels, they slowly begin to fall into the Mistweaver category of, what am I doing that Elemental or Enhance is not? Pretty much from like level 30 onwards, they just have no real advantages. They're still a healer, right? So I guess that is one advantage. Shamans have to go to resto if they want to be able to get faster queues for dungeons, which obviously all three of these specs, there's a tank in their class, so they can just switch to that for dungeon queues. So that is not an advantage for any of these three specs. But Resto Shaman has that going for it the entire way through. And even then, when Resto Shaman begins to fall off at later levels, they are still considerably better in terms of damage output than all three of these specs. Definitely better than like these two, and still quite a bit better than Mistweaver. So I cannot justify putting them in C tier, because they are significantly stronger than all three of these healers, and they are stronger than Outlaw Rogues. In fact, I would actually say they are stronger than Assassination Rogues. I would rather level a Resto Shaman solo questing all the way up to 60 than either of these two rogue specs. I'm going to put them here. I don't think they have the damage of like MM or balance or something like that. They don't really have any clear strengths, but they are definitely like, they probably do as much damage as Blood DKs, if we're being real. And survivability-wise, they may not be as tanky as Blood DK, but of course they have, you know, tools like their pets and stuff, you know, Earth Ellie, Fire Ellie. I don't think Resto gets Fire Ellie, but, you know. Also, you just really wouldn't play them for solo leveling. It's kind of the same thing of like, I'm putting Vengeance here with the understanding that you can make this work for solo leveling, but like you should just switch to Havoc. So I think generally speaking, if you were to play the entire way through, this is kind of where it would be, but you know, you have options, right? And the fact that they have the ability to switch is something in their favor. Okay, final two classes. First up, we have Warlock. So Warlock is... It's an interesting class for leveling. It is, for starters, it is the same thing that we discussed before of, you know, it's a class that has no real major gimmick for itself. It doesn't have, like, you could even argue for the record, like, I didn't touch upon this earlier, but rogues have stealth. That is actually technically feral druids do, but realistically, it's a thing that rogues excel at. And there have been times in the past where stealth for rogues was a really good gimmick. And ironically, rogues also have lockpicking, which currently has no real impact on the run. There have been times, especially in Shadowlands, where the ability to pick locks was actually quite good, though you could achieve the same effect with skeleton keys, so it wasn't really a rogue advantage. But I guess all that to say, as bad as rogues are, just because of the other reasons discussed, they have a core in that case is class features that nobody else really has access to. And warlocks, paladins, priests, while they may be good, don't really have that. So that's more just with the understanding that they're not really going to be able to breach the super high tiers. Obviously, we know S tier is locked, but like even with A tier, I'm going to put Demonology in B tier. So I'm going to skip around a little bit because I think the more interesting discussion is between Affliction and Destro. Demonology, I think most people would agree, is the weakest of the three for leveling. It's not bad. In fact, where would I actually put it? I think, do I put it above or below the Death Knights? I would rather play a Death Knight than Demonology. It's not bad. Not bad at all. The thing about Demonology is, well, it has solid damage. It has a very, like, ramp-focused build, where you're, like, summoning all these pets and then, like, spending your pets kind of, like, as a resource to do damage. So you have, like, a lot of build-up. So every single pull, you kind of have to ramp a little bit before you can get your damage. It's not bad enough to, like, really hinder it. And you're a Warlock, so Warlocks, everybody knows, are extremely tanky. That is something that applies to all three specs, I would say roughly equally. I think Affliction has ever so slightly better survivability than the other two specs, but I'm not even really going to factor that in because all three of them can kind of face tank stuff as a caster without really breaking a sweat, so it's really not a concern. I think the fact that Demonology has to rely on their pets, and they are significantly more turrety than the other two, is definitely its weakest thing. Destro is also fairly turrety. However, Destro has ludicrous damage output when built correctly. So, ah, yeah, I can't justify putting Demonology that much higher because its damage is just not really there, and it takes it too long for it to actually build up to the point where it can like do damage from pull to pull. But it's not bad. In fact, like I would much rather play Demonology than like sub. Hell, I would even rather play like Vengeance Demon Hunter just from like ease of use, but I still think it kind of deserves its spot. But it is pretty comparable to like a lot of these specs in terms of like time to kill on a lot of mobs. I could see it being put up higher. All of them have like Burning Rush. I think it is more the combination of like the ramping playstyle and the fact that it is turrety puts it there. Now, as for Affliction and Destruction, both of these are A tier specs, for sure. The question is, where do we put them? And which one is better? And for the longest time, I have said that I think Affliction is the better Warlock spec. I think that is still true, but I think it is worth noting that Destruction can come very close. So they're almost like better for different reasons. So Affliction is really good because obviously two reasons, right? It's a dot focused playstyle where you are able to very easily round up a bunch of different mobs. So while Destro can round up mobs with like a few different tag things, I forget what the name of the spell is, but it has like a burst of fire, not incinerate, that like instantly does damage, and that like generates soul shards, and then you like get a bunch of mobs together. You use channel demon fire while you're like kiting the mobs, and then you use your, it's like an AoE havoc that you put on the ground. I don't remember the names. I don't play them a lot, but you put it below the mobs, and then you get like a massive thing of chaos bolts and just erase a giant pool of mobs. And it has really good single target because effectively its AoE is just duplicating its single target onto multiple mobs. And that playstyle works really well. It does a ton of damage, but it is a little bit more turrety, and it is a little bit annoying because I remember there were times where that little patch in the ground that I would like try to, round all the mobs into and then chaos bolt them all, one mob would be slightly outside, and then it would be the lone survivor that I would have to finish off before going to the next pull. So I think that jankiness alone means that I can't justify putting Destruction above Affliction, because Affliction is just a little bit more straightforward, right? You dot up a bunch of mobs, you press C to Corruption, nothing can really kill you, you stack all the mobs as they're whacking you in the face, and then you kill off one of them and it starts a chain reaction that just blows up a gigantic pull. And single target, I would say Destro probably has a slight advantage, but Affliction's also perfectly fine for single target because you just dot up the mobs and then channel drain life. It just can't really do anything to you. So they're both really good, both comparable mobility. They have like Burning Rush and stuff like that. That said, I don't think either of them are amazing. Like, none of them really reach the highs of any of these specs. They're definitely not mages. I think any of these specs are significantly better. I'm going to put Affliction here. I think it is around the same power level as these specs. And I'm going to put Destruction here. There we go. Yeah. Because like when I think about Destruction reminds me a lot of Elemental Shaman, where they're both casters, they're both very turrety, and Destruction is a little bit more simplistic in that, you're hitting a bunch of things with Chaos Bolt, and like your bread and butter is Chaos Bolt and Channel Demon Fire. Channel Demon Fire is a really easy to use like channel that just does a ton of damage, low cooldown, but your bread and butter is Chaos Bolt and getting that duplicated on a bunch of mobs. So effectively you're juggling all these things to set up like a huge burst window and just erase a bunch of stuff. And Elemental Shaman is very similar in that, it's a caster and you're building up all of these mini cooldowns to then erase a pack of mobs or a single target with Stormkeeper duplicated lightning bolts or chain lightnings. So they feel fairly similar, but Whereas Elemental Shaman is a bit more complicated. Once you get the pattern down, it is much easier to like execute that stuff. You just have to use your abilities in the correct order, and then boom, there's your damage. But the jankiness of having to put that thing in the ground with, I think, Circle of Havoc or whatever, makes Destro a little bit harder to play. But it is good. So it definitely deserves to be an A tier. I'm putting Survival Hunter kind of in the middle because I like Survival. I think it is a good leveling spec. And I think that's a good way of kind of separating these two, which are both very comparable in how they play, but one is better than the other. And this also does a good way of separating Survival and BM, because I think Survival is a good bit better. So kind of works out perfectly in terms of the spacing. Okay. The Warrior specs. I think I put them all in A. Last class, I feel it would be like a bit uneventful if I just slammed them all into A tier, but like they kind of deserve to all be in A tier. Oh, how do I handle this? Okay, so let me talk a little bit before I honestly, yeah, okay. I'm gonna move them around to A tier, but I'm gonna put them all in here just so we can like have this set. All three of these specs are good. I don't think any of them deserve to be in B tier, but they all have their strengths and weaknesses. So obviously, Prot is a tank spec. Prot has the weakest single target out of all of these, but it is the tankiest. Now, survivability is not necessarily an issue for all of these specs. I think, I do think that, you know, it's something that they're not maybe like insanely good at, but if you're like good at using Victory Rush, you're good at using your defensive cooldowns, you can really survive some dangerous shit with both Arms and Fury. Fury has notably better self-healing than Arms, so it's not necessarily like better in the sense that it is stronger than Arms, because Arms is still very tanky when played correctly, but I think Fury is a bit easier to execute. So for newer players, Fury is almost certainly going to be the easiest of the two to play, but Prot is also very straightforward. Prot has really good survivability, it is very good passive healing, with obviously Victory Rush or Impending Victory, which is what you're going to be running while leveling. You have very consistent healing, and Prot takes very little damage. You know, with a shield while leveling, you're very good at just smoothing out your damage intake, even more so than like Stagger, and you have a Spell Reflect if there's any casters, which you don't fight too many casters while leveling, but if you do, you have that going for you. So Prot is a very safe, easy to play leveling experience. You have Revenge, you have Thunderclap. Thunderclap applies rends with, I forget what the talent is, but there's a talent that everybody's going to pick up as soon as possible where your Thunderclap applies rend to all targets if you have both talented, and that is your bread and butter for pretty much all three specs, but Prot especially makes very good use of that. So it's just a good spec. It is... How do I say this? It's worse in terms of, like, damage compared to the other tanks, so it is nowhere near these two. It is definitely weaker than Brewmaster in terms of damage. Brewmaster is pretty good for damage. It's not Windwalker, as we've already said. And while this is probably tankier than Brewmaster, it's definitely not as tanky as these two. It can struggle in some cases. But looking at like the other tank specs, like, does this do more damage than Blood? Oh yeah, it does way more damage than Blood. Does it do more damage than Vengeance? Yes, significantly. Is it tankier than Vengeance? Yes. So this definitely deserves to be an A tier. But it doesn't do quite as much damage as like a lot of the other specs up here. And Arms and Fury, I would say, for solo questing and stuff, are definitely a leap ahead of Prot, though Prot is still quite strong. As for how I would rank these, for starters, okay. I'm going to put them both above Brewmaster. I think that's a no-brainer. Another thing is, Warrior Mobility is some of the best in the game. Warrior Mobility is like on par with Monk, Druid, etc. It's very, very good. So that is a major strength. I would say as far as damage goes, like if survivability is not really a concern for these two specs, mobility is very strong, and we can really just rate them by how quickly they can kill mobs. They are certainly ahead of Brewmaster Affliction, all of these specs. I think now it's time to talk about some of the quirks of Arms and Fury. So Fury has the biggest quirk of almost any spec while leveling, outside of like some of the serious downsides of Outlaw. In fact, we can kind of compare Outlaw to Fury quite easily, because until you get Meat Cleaver, which I forget what the earliest level you get Meat Cleaver is, it's either level 33 or level 35. At one of those levels, Fury Warriors are able to get Meat Cleaver for the first time, and if you aren't familiar with Meat Cleaver, it makes it so after you press Whirlwind, your next 4 single target abilities will hit, I think, up to 5 targets, which you may notice a similarity between Outlaw, where Outlaw has pure single target and only does damage by keeping Blade Flurry up, which turns its single target abilities into AoE abilities. The difference is, Outlaw's Blade Flurry is a cooldown that it only has access to every, I think, minute and a half, and then later on you have cooldown reduction on Blade Flurry, which, unfortunately, to get the cooldown reduction on Blade Flurry, you need to be actively hitting mobs, and in order to actively hit mobs, you need to be face tanking them, which you can't do with your survivability. Like I said, Outlaw is just really bad. But the thing with Fury Warrior is all you need to do is press Whirlwind. So if you run out of charges of Meat Cleaver, you just press Whirlwind again, and then you get 4 more. And then with improved Meat Cleaver, or I think it's just improved Whirlwind or something, you get 8 attacks. So 1 Whirlwind, 8 AoE abilities with your Meat Cleaver, and then you press Whirlwind again, and it's really good. And because Fury Warrior has really, really, really nice self-sustain, you can do some really disgusting pulls. So I would say Fury Warrior at the higher levels, like level 40-ish plus, is up there with Fire Mage, with Havoc and stuff. Some of my fastest 60 to 70 times actually are done with a Fury Warrior. In fact, I think my second fastest 60 to 70 time right now was literally done with a Fury Warrior. Like my best times, unfortunately, one of the 60 to 70 runs that I did with Paladin was actually, the strat I used was patched. But my fastest times, I believe in order, are Guardian Druid, Fury Warrior, Windwalker Monk, Prot Pally. I haven't really done a lot of Arcane 60 to 70, but it's really good. And then I think after that, my Havoc Demon Hunter run would probably be the fastest. So, you can see why I've ranked them really highly. But whereas Guardian Druid, Windwalker, Prot Pally, and, Havoc are really, really, really good the entire way through, and start off really good, and I can justify putting them, like, in these higher tiers, Fury Warrior is really bad until you get Meat Cleaver. It's not like C tier bad, but it's like down here. It is a really just non-functional spec until that comes online. So it is one of the most, I would say, glaring cases of when your kit actually starts to work, you can do a lot of damage, but until then, you are fucked. Like, Fire Mage comes online at 35, but it's still good before then. Shadow Priest, similarly, gets really good at later levels, but is still good. A lot of these specs are kind of like that, with the exception of, like, these 5, which, whenever I've talked about, like, my best leveling specs, like my top 5, which is something I've gotten asked a lot, I've said pretty much these 3 specs many times, with Havoc sometimes floating in and out. And a lot of the times, I have said that I believe Fury Warrior is, like, the 5th best, along with Havoc. But I think the more that I've tested low-level warrior stuff, it is significantly worse. Whereas, like, these 4 specs are pretty much universally the best 4 leveling specs in the game the entire way through, with the exception of, like, Holy Priest is insane at, like, levels 10 to 30, but then, of course, falls off considerably more. So I think if we are, in that case, let's say, if we're saying that Holy Priest is low A tier, because it's insanely broken at low levels, but still good at high levels, but not, like, insane, I think we need to account for that in our ranking of Fury Warrior. So I'm going to put it here. I think I'm just going to keep it here. It is definitely really good, and it has the potential to be like as good as these other top specs when it gets its kit online. But it is also not very easy to play, which, once again, not including that in the ranking, but it is kind of like Fire Mage, a little bit easier, I would say, than Fire Mage, actually. But you're basically you need to like break your keyboard to play Fury correctly. It's tough. It's really tough. So I'm gonna keep it here. And arms, man, where do I put arms? So here's the thing about arms. Arms is also really good. But I honestly think that when Fury comes online, really comes online, gets all of its stuff, it is better than arms. But at the same time, arms is much stronger at lower levels, but is it that much stronger? And that's the thing, I don't know. I don't know if it's that much stronger. I could genuinely, like, if I left the tier list like this, I'd be kind of just fine with it. This is a tough one. Our arms feels very similar to these specs where, like, it does nothing spectacular. It's kind of good at lower levels. I think, though, Enhance gets better early AoEs, same with Ret Paladin. Arms is slightly weaker at lower levels, definitely better than Fury. And it gets maybe a little bit stronger than these two specs, but I think one of the other things is, while Arms has really good cooldowns, like Die by the Sword is absolutely busted, it doesn't have insanely good healing. It does have Spell Reflect, though, which makes it good against casts. I don't know. I think I might just keep it where it is now. All three of these specs are really, really close. All four of these, really. With Fury being the notable exception of it can go higher, but I think it needs to be the lowest out of these four. But, I mean, like, think about it like this. All of these are melee DPS, and they all play very similar. They just use different things, right? It's just builder spender. I think, like, Ret Paladin and Enhancement, like I said, feel almost identical in terms of how they play. They have builders, they have spenders, except you're building Holy Power and then spending it. You're building Maelstrom, then you're spending it. You have a self-healing spell that you use to keep yourself alive. You have good single target, good AoE. Divine Steed, Ghost Wolf form, or Spirit Walk on top of that. And Fury Warrior and Arms, they don't have like a self-heal ability, but they have like passive healing with impending victory and stuff, which is kind of like a self-heal. And they have like shields and stuff that they can get. So I think putting all four of these specs here, they're all just really good. I think while these guys have more mobility, these guys have more survivability and slightly better early AoE. So I think they're all pretty interchangeable with, am I really putting Shadow Priest ahead of all these? I think I really am. It's hard to say. Admittedly, I haven't done as many Shadow Priest runs as I have for, like, a lot of these specs, but the few Shadow Priest runs that I've done recently have just felt ludicrously powerful. It is just a really good spec. Yeah, I think this is fair. I think this is it. I honestly, I'm looking at it. I don't know what else I would change. I think my top 5, I'm really happy with. I think Fire being the number 6, Shadow Priest being where it is, you know, these ones, Brewmaster, solidly middle of A tier. We definitely have a beefier A tier, and I said I can maybe see myself moving some of these around, but I'm honestly kind of happy with everything being where it is. Even the stuff that I bumped down to B tier, because I could, like, there are no real clear weaknesses, right, for any of these. Destro is maybe a little bit janky. In fact, the more I think about it, I kind of feel like moving Destro below BM. I think BM is just a little bit better because of Destro's jankiness, but it still has no real weaknesses. Just, like, not really super good. Prot Warrior has no clear weaknesses, but is definitely slightly lower in the damage department, but I think whenever you're still able to very easily kill things, it's like right around there with Feral, whereas like this has slightly lower damage, this is slightly lower survivability, but their time to kill is roughly the same because you can just face tank and Feral can just kite. Frost Mage, I think being B tier makes sense because its mobility is notably worse than Fire and Arcane, and its damage is definitely significantly behind, even if it can still kill things at a reasonable pace. I feel bad about Death Knights being so low. I think one of the problems with Death Knights is they used to have a bit of an advantage where they would automatically learn their riding training at level 20, and that actually really helped them because I said before how you have to go back to your main city and learn riding, and that would like waste time, and there were like ways that you could shave off time there, and that was a big advantage for Death Knights. They also have On a Pale Horse, which gives them slightly faster mounted speed, but Death Knights, while they haven't technically been nerfed, right? Like every other class got buffed because everybody else now no longer needs to go back and learn riding training, so Death Knights don't have that advantage. And one of the other funny things is coming in the very next patch that will be out in like less than a month, you're going to be able to dragon ride in the older like Kalimdor Eastern Kingdom zones, and that's going to make traditional flying way less impactful. In fact, one of the things that, I have been thinking about is dragon riding reduces the value of flight form. Now, Guardian Druid will still be really good, and flight form has utility that outweighs, I think, the speed component of it. So there are still going to be situations where flight form will be really good. So I don't think this will change. However, if dragon riding makes Druid flight form no longer as big of an advantage, maybe there's a situation where I go back to using Windwalker monks for speedruns. Hell, maybe there's a situation where their class utility becomes so devalued that one of these three can end up just being faster because they are slightly better at killing things. I'm not saying they necessarily are, but I think there's a possibility that they could be. I don't know for sure, but the introduction of dragon riding is very interesting. Unfortunately, it also means that stuff like On a Pale Horse is less impactful because 10% increased mount speed feels a lot more significant when you're moving at like 300% speed compared to when you're moving at 700% speed on a dragon riding mount. It's just not going to matter. So I feel really bad because like if you had asked me to make this tier list like 2 years ago, I would have put Death Knights at least one of these specs, probably Frost. Unholy has actually gotten significantly better with a lot of the Dragonflight changes, even if the class as a whole has fallen. Frost was, I think, the clear dominant spec for many, many years, and it's still good, don't get me wrong. But the class as a whole, their mobility issue has gotten worse and worse and more apparent as everybody else has gotten better and better. And while I would have probably put Frost in like low to mid A tier if this was like Shadowlands or early Dragonflight, a lot of the recent changes have just heavily devalued some of the advantages that Death Knights have had. Also, there's just like the weird thing where their Icarus teleport doesn't let them go to Orgrimmar Stormwind. Those are just not there in like the new versions of Icarus, so they don't have that advantage that like Zen Pilgrimage gives you, which is just kind of weird. So yeah, I'm kind of happy with everything else. A lot of these I kind of already knew going in. Like, whenever you're playing Balanced Druid and MM, you just feel like, yeah, this feels like a B tier spec. But I think I kind of, like, going in, it was like these specs around here, like in the bottom of A tier and top of B, that I was most unsure. And I kind of felt that I would need to see them all laid out on the tier list before I can make a final verdict on where I think everything falls. But I'm quite happy with this. I think that something that surprises me is I kind of expected Blood DK to end up higher on my own tier list. I know it may sound crazy, like, all of this is coming from my head anyway, like, but I always think about Blood DK being more useful because of its unkillable nature, but when I think about it, it's just like, its damage is so bad. Just to, I guess, quickly touch upon this again, one of the issues with Blood DK is its damage is just so poorly scaled right now in its base kit. It really is just not good. And then the problem is when it gets to higher levels, where like a lot of the other weaker-ish specs, like Vengeance Demon Hunter starts off as bad as Blood DK in terms of its damage, but Vengeance gets a lot of really big damage upgrades as it hits the higher levels. Blood DK gets like Shattering Bone, which isn't even really that good, and forces it to stand inside of its Death and Decay and get hit by mobs for the Bone Shield charges to explode and deal most of its damage. That applies to endgame too. I hate playing Blood DK. This spec fucking sucks, man. I really don't like Blood DK, but this especially feels bad in a leveling context where survivability isn't nearly as important, and a lot of specs can hit the threshold where you just aren't able to die, and the mobility issue is even more impactful. There's just really nothing Blood DK has going for it, but it works at least, which is more than can be said for these 4 specs. I guess as a final note, so I know I've already spent almost 3 hours talking about this, but just to wrap things up, I am very curious to see what happens with these 3 specs. I know I kind of like glossed over them because it's just really impossible to evaluate them on an even playing field, like I said before. So many specs feel really comparable at level 60. And the other problem is, like, you have things like, for instance, Fury Warrior, where, as I've already said, Fury Warrior is one of the strongest specs when it gets its kit online. So think about, like, Devastation Evoker in the context of Fury. Fury is ludicrously good from 60 onwards, but Fury is really not good in the lower levels because of the way that the talent pathing works out. And we don't really know how that will play out for Devoker. We can kind of look at its talent tree and be like, maybe it'll be missing XYZ key talents and that'll severely impact it. But we can't really say for sure until we actually get our hands on it and play test it at lower levels. It's just never really been tested in that way. And that means that Devastation Evoker, which I should note is very good, if we are going to rank it purely for 60, I would change up a lot of these rankings if they were purely 60 to 70. It would still look fairly similar, but I would shift things around quite a bit. But Devastation Evoker would be like up here. It's very good for 60 to 70 leveling. It has good mobility. It's a caster, and the empowered stuff kind of sucks because obviously having to sit there and like build up a big empowered cast doesn't feel super great. But the fact that you can just send out like an empowered rank 1 fire breath and still have it do a lot of damage up front and a decent amount of damage over time, because it's like the same, the only thing that changes is how much is up front versus how much is in the dot. And stuff like I forget what the name of the ability is, but like the big burst of damage that hits like multiple targets depending on how much you charge it up, like Essence Surge or something like that. That is like on single target, still really easy to cast. And also you have Tip the Scales, so if you're fighting like a big pull of mobs, you can tip the scales and do like your big power surge and do a massive amount of burst damage to a ton of mobs. And obviously your mastery means that you're doing more damage to mobs at higher health, and that works really well in the leveling setting where you're fighting like fresh mobs pull to pull. So you can do one big pull, set up like a big Dragon Rage, Tip the Scales, like Essence Surge or whatever it's called, and just delete an entire pack. Next pull, you just send out a bunch of pyres, you're burning mobs from like high health. So Devoker, at least with its current kit at level 60, feels phenomenal and actually has the potential to be a very good leveling spec. I don't know if it would be the best. I think one of the issues is the survivability is not amazing. It definitely struggles if it has to face tank. It can kite a little bit, like with hover, you're able to do stuff on the move and not have to worry too much about getting hit, but there are times where you will have to sit there and cast, so I don't know if it will ever be able to truly reach like the tops, but I am curious to see how it would feel from like a low level start. Conversely, I have no fucking clue what they're going to do with augmentation. Because augmentation doesn't even work for leveling right now. Just period. Like in level 60 to 70. The spec is just fucking trash. It doesn't fit in with World of Warcraft. I ranted about this a long time, and I'm talking endgame. It completely breaks the World of Warcraft endgame. Any really serious endgame player will tell you that. But especially while leveling, like, what the fuck is this spec supposed to do? It does fuck all on its own. Its entire purpose is to simp other players and buff their damage and give them, like, survivability. But, like, the passive survivability benefits mean nothing in a leveling context. It isn't actually significant at all. They're actually really squishy. And the damage that you're buffing other players for is tuned around max level players in raid gear because it is percentage based buffs where you're like giving them versatility or percent damage increases. So just by definition, it does not work for leveling. You're offering no damage proportional to what people are able to do. It's terrible. It's just a terrible spec. And this is when it has its entire kit. So at low levels, I don't even know if they should let you play as Og. I think Og is something where it's like if they want to keep it the same, which I have said before, remove the spec, rework it, make it a tank spec, make me be able to play as a dragon tank. I would love that. But as it currently stands, Og, I don't even think should be accessible for players until they hit like level 60 or something, because this is, how are you going to play this? Right? Like, it feels bad to even give it to people as an option to do solo leveling with from 60 to 70. If you give players the ability to select this, you're going to have new players clicking on Augmentation Evoker at level 10 and saying, this looks cool, I'll try this. And then because they're brand new players who are unfamiliar with MMOs and don't really want to step into dungeons just yet, they're going to try to play this in the open world, fail to kill literally anything because it is just a terribly designed spec, and then be like, okay, well, this game sucks, and then bounce. I don't know. It's just weird. But I am curious to see how it plays out. I will definitely be testing these specs heavily whenever they start from level 10, because I'm very curious to see. But with that, I think we've covered everything about this tier list. This has been a long time coming. A ton of research went into this, as I said before. So I hope you enjoyed watching it, and look forward to more speedruns coming over the next few months. Obviously, I've finally finished my long-time goal of testing every spec. This has kind of been one of the main driving factors of doing the various runs over like the last year, especially. So that chapter is kind of closed now that the tier list is done, but there are still a few more things that I want to test going forward, and we'll see kind of how that all plays out. But anyways, thank you for watching. If you disagree with my opinion on any specs, or you have something else to add that you think is relevant, please feel free to discuss it in the comments. I will respond to really as many comments as I can. Usually I try to read and at least give a response to any comments, especially if it like directly asks me a question. So would be happy to have discussion about this tier list, and I'll include the link to it in the description if you want to make your own. I don't think I'll be actively monitoring it to see what people make, but if you want to like make your own version of this tier list, then they'll like screenshot it and send it to me on Discord and be like, oh, what do you think? Like, I'd be happy to respond to that. But anyways, thank you for watching. Throw this video a like if you enjoyed it. Helps in the algorithm. And if for whatever reason you are not subscribed, please do so you can see more stuff like this. But yeah, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.